Lord of Mystery, Paradox Pathway by author D. Nan. Chapter 626-654. Welcome to Fanfic Audiobook, your go-to place for immersive audiobooks. If you enjoy the content, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories. And those who want to support me, I have a Patreon channel, get early access to video on Patreon. Time rewinds to before the new year. Dinner's ready. With a slightly urging shout, the children still playing in the yard immediately gathered. This was an orphanage, but unlike the notorious facilities that often served as villains in novels, anime, and games, there was no selling of children, no child abuse, no embezzlement of donations, no mutual bullying, and no other distressing issues like exploiting child labor. This was simply a perfectly legitimate child adoption center, and because one of its benefactors was a truly compassionate prominent figure who often came to inspect personally, not just for show, no dirt was allowed to fester here. Only recently, a less sociable child arrived here. His name was Eamon. Although the surname, A, is relatively rare in the Zhonghua family, the orphanage would not rename a child for such a reason, or rather, even if a renaming were to occur, it would be a matter for the adopters to consider. In fact, for ease of memory, the orphanage staff wished every child was named A something. Amon's personality was more solitary than other children his age, he liked to sit alone in a corner. However, the orphanage staff didn't mind his personality. Most orphans, upon first arriving at the orphanage, had some psychological issues to varying degrees. But no staff member would have imagined that this thin boy, who looked only 6 or 7 years old and had a faint birthmark around his right eye, was once a god of deception. Listening to the noisy voice of the plump woman, Eamon initially wanted to ignore her, but considering his current body was no different from an ordinary child's, he eventually lifted his leg and walked towards the dining room. Children of all sizes sat obediently on small stools, gathered around low tables that were just right for them, eating stewed noodles that had no appealing presentation but were relatively balanced in nutrition. Eamon watched as several women occasionally walked up to a child or two who weren't eating much, picked up a spoon, and began to feed them, involuntarily showing a look of disgust, then feeling a bit annoyed. Damn it, this body can't even control emotions now. Eamon thought to himself, his mind recalling the battle for Saphira Castle a few months ago. Courage and sacrifice. Eamon repeated the explanation that person had given him, then looked at his tender little hands, waving the iron spoon to shove the surprisingly tasty food into his mouth, all while thinking about how to escape this cage. Yes, a cage. At least in Amon's mind, that's what this place was. As punishment for his failure, he was stripped of all Beyonder abilities, confined to such a weak body, like an insect, and cast into a world without transcendent power. Did he seem to think he could learn something about humanity here? Eamon didn't quite understand what his father was thinking, but one thing he had confirmed through the orphanage's general knowledge classes. This should be the ancient Earth, the civilization of the previous epoch, the place where the current the Fool, Evernight, Black Emperor, Paradox, and his father originally lived. He didn't know how this was achieved. In fact, at first, he even thought he had been thrown into the current the Fool's puppet kingdom. However, after a few days of living here, he gradually realized that these people were all just ordinary living beings. In a place like this, with a bunch of brats, listening to them talk about moral character, and language arts and math every day, can I learn humanity? What a joke. Eamon was very suspicious of his father's actions. If accepting those values that made him feel somewhat nauseous counted as learning humanity, then he felt the most appropriate thing his father should have done was to brainwash him with a visionary's ability. Little Meng, why aren't you eating? You won't grow if you don't eat enough. A somewhat goosebump-inducing voice came from the plump auntie's mouth. Amon's face immediately darkened, and he promptly shook his head, using the innocent voice a child should have. Sorry, I was just thinking about the animation I watched last night. I got a bit distracted. With that, he immediately lowered his head and stuffed the stewed noodles from his bowl into his mouth, not giving the other party a chance to blow on it and feed him. That humiliation was enough once. Watching Eamon start to eat properly, the plump auntie nodded in satisfaction, then walked towards the next child, which further solidified Amon's determination to escape here. After lunch, the children were arranged for a nap. Eamon, unable to resist with his small body, could only lie helplessly on the communal sleeping mat, listening to the quiet chatter of the little brats next to him, contemplating his escape plan. This is an orphanage. Although the environment is good, it should be similar to those orphan relief centers over there. So, the most normal way to leave is to be adopted. But I've been here for several days, and I haven't seen anyone come to adopt children. Maybe the procedures here are different from over there. Amon's small brain spun rapidly, but he found that he, who was famous for his cunning, was actually not good at such thinking. He had never thought from a mortal's perspective. In the past, let alone a group of mortals, even if suppressed by a true god, he could find loopholes using beyonder powers. But now, he was just an ordinary child, like an ant. He was too weak now, without power, he could do nothing. However, as this thought arose, his previously stifled thoughts suddenly changed, and a hint of understanding flashed in his eyes. Is this why you turned me into this? Eamon looked at the ceiling, as if staring at someone. Interesting. Then let me take on this challenge. Thinking this, Eamon suddenly felt a surge of fighting spirit, because he had changed his mindset, altering his perception of his predicament. A few minutes ago, he only felt that all of this was a humiliation, imprisonment, and mockery, but now, he only felt that it was a game between him and his father. Thus, Eamon in the orphanage gradually lowered his guard and began to actively communicate with other children, joining various activities. Whether it was broadcast gymnastics, jump rope, or the daily general knowledge classes, he participated in everything, as if he had completely integrated into this big family. But just as the orphanage staff were delighted that this unsociable child was finally beginning to change, on the last day before the new year, when everyone was preparing for the festivities, Eamon disappeared. Want to trap me? Eamon stood outside the orphanage, looking at the not-so-tall wall, a scornful smile on his face. Though he didn't know why, everyone was particularly focused on this evening. It was precisely by taking advantage of everyone's busy schedules that Eamon, who had spent several days thoroughly familiarizing himself with the entire orphanage, managed to escape. Even without his beyonder abilities, those past memories remained in his mind. He could easily find the blind spots in the security personnel's vision and thoughts, and quickly determine where he could hide. Although he misjudged some heights, resulting in a few minor scrapes, this was clearly not an issue. Eamon had been eating well these past few days, so his body was in good condition. Where to next? Eamon slowly walked along the unfamiliar streets, looking at the vehicles that were completely different from those in his era, feeling a bit lost for a moment. This damned body. Suddenly, Eamon seemed to react, muttering a complaint. He pulled a candy from his pocket, popped it into his mouth, and then began looking for a target to work on. Yes, work on, because he had no money and no food. The 3 meals at the orphanage were all easy to digest, relatively balanced in nutrition, and not easily picked at by children, such as mashi, stewed noodles, and multigrain meat porridge, because even if a child didn't like a certain vegetable in these foods, it was hard to pick out, and there was no need to worry about leftovers. However, this also meant they were difficult to preserve. The only food Eamon currently had were some candies he'd been rewarded by the aunties for good behavior. And candies, obviously, weren't enough to fill him up. Perhaps because the new year was approaching, there were quite a few pedestrians on the street. Eamon had learned some things about the outside world during his time in the orphanage, such as traffic rules, the currency of this world, and of course, some written language. Eamon was very glad at this moment that he had secretly learned a bit of the local language from the current the fool's memory, just to scare him. Otherwise, he wouldn't even be able to read the signs on the walls now. Walking along the street, Eamon bypassed places like restaurants and convenience stores, heading towards more crowded areas. Many pedestrians on the street were pulling small carts, and they seemed to have similar destinations. This is probably to buy what they call New Year goods. If that's the case, they should all be carrying money, right? Eamon thought, his dark, round eyes constantly scanning the pockets of these people, searching for wallets. Although he had almost never truly stolen items with his hands, the marauder potion had been in his body for so many years, and the knowledge of thievery had long been ingrained in his instincts. However, something embarrassing occurred. Why did none of these people carry wallets? Eamon couldn't understand this situation. In the orphanage's general knowledge class, he had seen the currency of this world. Surely these well-dressed people weren't buying everything on credit, were they? Eamon, unwilling to give up, wandered the streets for over half an hour, touching countless pockets along the way, but found no wallets or coins. He did, however, find a few strange devices the size of an adult's palm. But pressing them would prompt him to enter a fingerprint or something, followed by continuous error messages. Amon's marauder knowledge from another world simply couldn't open the lock on these devices. Tisk, Eamon felt his stomach growing hungrier and decided to follow the crowd to where they were buying things, to understand what these people were actually using for transactions. Just then, however, Eamon keenly noticed a gaze fixed upon him. As a thief, Eamon could easily detect malice in someone's eyes. He almost immediately abandoned the idea of stealing, using his small stature to his advantage to slip into the crowd, attempting to escape. But being small naturally meant slower movement. After running a few hundred meters, an unremarkable-looking man blocked his path, and from behind, a hand grabbed his collar. "You little brat, who are you with?" A voice tinged with anger came from the man holding him from behind. As a seasoned parasite, Eamon immediately found a similar scenario in his vast memory. These two men were likely local gang members, and they had mistaken him for a pickpocket controlled by another gang. Thinking this, Eamon immediately displayed the acting skills expected of the god of deception, pitifully saying, "I'm a lone wolf, my previous boss got caught." A lone wolf. The man blocking him showed a ferocious smile, then slapped Eamon, making blood seep from the corner of his mouth and stars appear before his eyes. Eamon felt utterly humiliated, yet he knew he couldn't deal with these two at the moment. He could only continue to feign weakness, pulling out a few adult palm-sized bricks from the small of his back. He had taken many of these earlier but didn't know how to use them, only thinking they might be worth some money, so he kept a few of the best-looking ones. He now pushed the bricks towards the men, saying, "This is all my haul for today. I just wanted to steal a few coins for a meal. Who knew they all don't carry money when they go out? If you can give me a bite to eat, my life will be yours from now on." "All right, kid, you've got some guts." The man behind him released Eamon, taking the bricks from his hand, his expression a bit subtle. He had seen this kid looking for time, a slang term for money, thinking he was some kid from another gang poaching territory, but he never expected to encounter a wild professional. Seeing how poorly the kid spoke, even if he was kidnapped, he wouldn't be a rich young master. As for a hook, meaning an informant, they wouldn't send such a young kid. Thinking this, the man gave his companion a look. The other man nodded, patted Eamon's shoulder, and said with a smile, "Want to join us? Do you know the rules?" "And no, I don't," Eamon deliberately stammered, then said with a somewhat simple-minded expression. "Things I find go to the boss, and the boss provides food." "All right then, you can follow as two brothers for now. First, let's deal with your haul, then we'll take you for a good meal." Eamon saw the man tuck the bricks into his pocket, thinking that these things indeed seemed to be worth something. He then reached up to wipe the blood from the corner of his mouth and obediently followed behind the man. Seeing him so obedient, the man thought his previous boss must have trained him well. While lamenting picking up a treasure on New Year's Eve, he checked the few phones. People these days were increasingly unwilling to carry cash on the streets. While phones were worth something, they ultimately needed to be sold by specialists, and most of the profit was usually swallowed by the fence. The brands are all over the place. Looks like this kid doesn't know what's valuable, seems I'll have to teach him how to recognize brands. On the 9th day of the Lunar New Year, the city, which should still have been filled with lingering festive cheer, was instead filled with the wail of police sirens. Inside an old residential complex, over a dozen police officers surrounded a second-floor room, blocking it off completely. Two relatively young officers leaned against the wall, dry heaving into paper bags, while the older officers all wore serious expressions, discussing something in low voices. They were the beat cops for this area. In this city, which was neither too big nor too small, such a heinous crime hadn't occurred in many years. "Where's the body?" Suddenly, a steady voice came from the stairwell. The old police officer at the door immediately went to meet him and said, "Still inside." According to the informant's statement, he passed by this morning on his way out, smelled a strong scent of blood, noticed the door was ajar, and took a look. Although there was a puddle of vomit at the entrance, the inside wasn't damaged. The newly arrived Serious Crimes Unit police officer nodded, gave his companion a look, and everyone immediately took out shoe covers and gloves, walking into the room despite the unpleasant smell. The forensic doctor, carrying a small box, stepped forward and began examining the two bodies. P.S. If the autopsy is written in too much detail, it's easy to get deleted. A general conclusion will suffice. Please understand, time of death is within 24 hours. The cause of death is excessive blood loss. The tendons in both victims' hands and feet were severed, and the knife wounds were very clean. One of them had been repeatedly beaten in the face to the point of disfigurement. They were likely first incapacitated, then tied up and tortured until they bled to death. What's the background of that informant? Why would he open the door after smelling blood? The detective listened to the forensic doctor's report, then turned to the police officer who had been guarding the door. The old police officer shook his head and said, "He's a habitual thief, or rather, there are quite a few residents in this kind of complex who engage in illicit activities. I suspect he saw the door unlocked and wanted to get some benefit, but he didn't expect to see bodies. Fearing he'd be made a scapegoat, he reported it. Have the surrounding residents all been questioned? And the identities of the deceased?" The detective stroked his chin, his expression slightly grave. In his experience, such a gruesome death was clearly for revenge, and the wounds on the hands and feet were very clean, indicating that the killer was likely a repeat offender. The deceased were also two habitual thieves. According to the neighbors, they brought a child back before the new year, but we haven't found the child or a body. Also, they've been spending lavishly these past few days. Here are the statements. The old police officer said, taking a stack of statements from a nearby colleague and handing them to the detective. The detective nodded, casually picking out a few to read as he said. This child might have important clues. Check the surveillance cameras nearby to see if you can find footage of that child. If not, have the surrounding neighbors create a facial composite. Additionally, check if there have been any missing children cases recently. This matter might be related to child abduction. Just as the police began their operation, the culprit of it all was walking down the street, carrying a small bag. After gaining a slight understanding of the local thieves' code of conduct, Eamon dealt with the two idiots who dared to offend him. Although he currently had no Beyonder abilities, it was still as he said, the characteristics of the Marauder pathway had been with him for so long that even without the ability, the knowledge and such had long since permeated him. With a Marauder's control over a dagger, he was still capable of dealing with two individuals who hadn't been on guard against him from the start. After all, the thieves of this world didn't have any Beyonder spiritual intuition. Auntie, give me 2 meat buns. Walking up to a breakfast stall, Eamon pulled out a paper bill and bought 2 buns under the other party's somewhat unwilling gaze. This gave Eamon a new understanding of how unwelcome paper currency was in this world. Without that brick, smartphone, truly nothing can be done. Eamon shook his head, feeling quite helpless. In the past few days, he had secretly learned how to use that brick, called a smartphone, and then he realized that a child like him, even with a smartphone, couldn't use electronic payments because he didn't have an ID card. This really is. Eamon sighed. As the god of deceit, who had never worried about making a living and had spent his entire life seeking amusement, he realized for the first time the difficulty of life. No wonder that guy felt at ease throwing me into the orphanage. With this body, if I'm not careful, I'll be found by the police here and sent back, won't I? Eamon seemed to realize his father's sinister intentions. In this world, without an ID card, nothing was easy to do. And even if he got an ID card, he couldn't open a bank account, unless there was truly a fool who could be tricked into giving him their ID card, bank card, and password all at once. What made him even more desperate was that this world also had a dreadful thing called reporting loss, which meant that even if he tricked someone into giving him what he wanted, as soon as the other party reported it lost, he couldn't use it anymore. Do you think this can stump me? Eamon muttered to himself, but he was devouring the meat buns. No matter how frail his body was, the strength he could exert when full versus when hungry was worlds apart. The 2 meat buns were quickly finished. He also felt the fatigue in his legs, so he found a random step to sit on. He looked at his own reflection in a nearby window, then thoughtfully pinched the area around his right eye. This birthmark is a bit conspicuous, I need to find a way to cover it. Eamon mumbled to himself, but he wasn't worried. In fact, the reason he dared to kill those 2 idiots was precisely because he already had a complete plan. In these few short days, he had learned a lot of useful information through that thing called a television, such as the existence of something called concealer in this world, which could cover blemishes on the face. Even a pockmarked face could become incredibly fair and clear with just a dab. At this time, Eamon didn't yet know what advertising effect, or post-production, meant. However, to get this item, he would have to go to a supermarket. He had already been to the supermarket. Not long ago, he had been taken there by those 2 idiots to look for time, money. Slipping into the supermarket, Eamon swaggered through the crowd as if his adult was right beside him. This largely avoided the possibility of being noticed by sales assistants. Well, a child's body meant that once discovered, he would be sent to the reception desk, and an announcement would be made to find his parents. Don't ask him how he knew. In short, after finally reaching the cosmetics section, Eamon was dumbfounded, because there were simply too many cosmetics there. And there wasn't just Roselian text on them, but also all sorts of strange letter languages, which gave him a headache for a moment. Moreover, as a child, he couldn't even ask a sales assistant where that thing called concealer was. Miscalculation. Eamon, who had secretly used concealer in the mall, looked at the mirrors everywhere. The still faintly visible dark circles under his eyes seemed to be silently mocking him. It seems to have been cursed. Eamon, not yet realizing he had fallen victim to false advertising, thought to himself, even suspecting that the dark circles on his face were a mark, deliberately added by his father and the current the fool. Although there were slight deviations from the plan, it wasn't enough to affect the overall situation. Moreover, Eamon currently had no retreat. After a brief period of thought, he began to follow the plan and prepare to escape the city. Because those two idiots used mobile payments to fence their stolen goods, he didn't have much cash on hand, which forced him to look for cheaper ways to travel. However, very soon, he wouldn't need to consider travel methods anymore. Because, a hand holding a wet wipe covered his mouth from behind. A strong headache and throat discomfort, accompanied by a gradual return to consciousness, surged into his mind. Eamon frowned, only to find his eyes blindfolded, his mouth stuffed with something, and his hands and feet roughly bound, which sent a chill through him. What's going on? Are they accomplices of those two people seeking revenge? Or have I run into human traffickers, like those discussed in the orphanage's general knowledge class? Eamon subtly wiggled his fingers, confirming the state of his bindings, and finally let out a slight sigh of relief. His condition was not bad, it seemed the other party didn't intend to kill him directly. Although that was the case, Eamon felt extremely uncomfortable at this moment. He had always been in an absolutely safe position, even when contending with the current the fool for Saphira Castle, his main body remained with his father. But now, he had no choice but to put his main body at risk. Just thinking that he might truly die made Eamon feel unbearable. Not to mention that those who might kill him were, in his eyes, mere insects, not even worthy of being called ants. This was also why he had killed those two marauders in such a cruel manner. It was the first time he had ended a life with a mindset other than amusement or purpose. Because when facing those two ants, Eamon was afraid. This was something his pride could not tolerate. As for whether his father would let him die, Eamon was originally confident, but now, he couldn't be sure. Because he couldn't guarantee that he wouldn't become a clone. This sounded a bit ridiculous, but it was the truth. Although Eamon had clones all over the world, firstly, his main body controlled the uniqueness, and secondly, he always tried his best to ensure that the clones he separated were of a lower rank than his main body. The only time he took a risk was when he was contending with the current the fool for Saphira Castle. And at that time, his father was also protecting his main body. But now, he had lost his uniqueness, and his main body had no characteristics at all. So, was he now the main body or a clone? Eamon tried his best to stop himself from overthinking, but he found he couldn't. This human body was not as easy to control as a mythical creature. He would panic, fear, and overthink, and these were things the current Eamon couldn't control. All he could do was constantly sink into fear, nothing more. However, the human brain eventually tires. After any emotion persists for a sufficient amount of time, the corresponding senses begin to numb. Eamon gradually broke free from that panic and began to re-examine his situation. Although the binding technique was skilled, it was not difficult to untie it with the skills of a marauder. The question was, where exactly was he now? If the people who had captured him were nearby, then untying the ropes would undoubtedly be suicidal. He tried his best to calm his mind, which was already overwhelmed by fear, to smooth out his breathing rhythm, and then, as much as possible, to focus his attention on his ears. Although for Eamon, hearing was actually a sense with very little presence, as a natural mythical creature, he possessed special senses far superior to hearing. But undoubtedly, now, he could only hope that this body had a pair of sufficiently sharp ears. Perhaps it was psychological, but as Eamon gradually calmed down, everything seemed to become quieter, and faint, subtle sounds then entered his ears. The rustle of clothes, the faint sobbing of young children, and occasionally, two slightly heavy breaths could be heard from a distance. That should be an adult. There really is a guard, isn't there? Eamon felt a chill in his heart, but he continued to listen intently, while also relying on his strong sense of time to silently count the minutes in his mind. It was ironic, in a way. Eamon, who had always treated time as a toy he could manipulate at will, now had to be grateful for his precise sense of time. He didn't know how long he had been unconscious, nor did he possess the technique of judging the passage of time based on hunger. Although this wouldn't have been difficult for his former self, Eamon, who had never known what hunger was, had never even considered such things. Time passed by minute. After about 3 or 4 hours, Eamon suddenly frowned slightly, because he heard the sound of a lock opening. Who? The man, who had not made a sound the entire time, leading Eamon to believe he had fallen asleep, suddenly asked. A woman's voice immediately came from the direction of the door. It's me. Why are you back so early today? I made 3 scores. I was afraid something would happen if I left them, so I came back to watch. The man's tone softened slightly. The newcomer must have been an acquaintance of his. And then, the sound of shoes scuffing against the ground reached Amon's ears, along with the woman's surprised voice. 3 scores. Were they done cleanly? What's their quality like? They all look pretty clever, probably kids who ran away to play during the new year. 2 boys and 1 girl, definitely won't be hard to sell, the man said with certainty. The woman nodded, and Eamon heard footsteps slowly approaching. Then, a force removed the blindfold from his head. As the man and woman came into Amon's view, the woman's exasperated voice also rang out. Why does this one have a birthmark? Such an obvious mark makes it easy to trace. The man, hearing this, said indifferently. They're being sold into a remote mountain village, and it's not a girl. Who cares about a birthmark? Besides, even if no one wants him, breaking his legs and tossing him to the beggars is still a way to make money, isn't it? Exclamation mark, exclamation mark, exclamation mark. Amon's eyes widened instantly upon hearing this. In the past few days, those 2 idiots, in order to keep an eye on him, their cash cow, had told him a lot about human traffickers, often mentioning things like mutilation for begging. Thinking of this, Eamon forcefully pushed out the rag in his mouth with his tongue and shouted. I escaped from the orphanage. No one will look for me, really. Don't throw me to the beggars. Quote question mark question mark question mark quote. As Eamon spoke, the group of men and women exchanged glances, their expressions turning strange. Eamon, in turn, felt a strong sense of unease from their gazes. After a brief silence, the man suddenly pulled out a roll of tape from the corner, and without a word, grabbed a cloth, stuffed it into Amon's mouth, and then sealed it with tape. Only then did the woman complain. I told you earlier not to mind the trouble. It's one thing if you're afraid of damaging their brains and use less medicine, but how much does tape cost? I'm just afraid the tape would be uncomfortable and wake them up, making them noisy, aren't I? The man immediately explained, but the woman glared at him fiercely. What if they make a little noise? What if he shouts when you're not paying attention? We'll both be in trouble. This place is in the middle of nowhere, what can he do by shouting? The man looked indifferent, but the woman frowned and said, Are you the boss or am I the boss? Hearing this, the man immediately fell silent, and only then did the woman turn her gaze to Eamon and say, I don't care if what you said is true or false. In short, if you behave, it's just a matter of going to a different family to eat. But if we find you making any small moves, we'll gouge out one of your eyes first. Woo woo, woo woo. Eamon immediately nodded vigorously, but because his hands and feet were tied, he instantly lost his balance and hit his head on the ground. The 2 human traffickers didn't care and walked towards the remaining 2 children. Eamon, face down, turned his head and watched their movements out of the corner of his eye. The 2 children, a boy and a girl, looked a little older than him, but no more than 10 years old. The fabric of both their clothes was very common, he learned this from the 2 marauders, so they shouldn't be from a wealthy family. The 2 children seemed to be in poorer physical condition than him and were still unconscious, but judging from the expressions of the 2 human traffickers, they seemed very satisfied. Soon, Eamon discovered that there were actually more than 5 people in the room. By the door, there was also an unconscious girl. This must have been brought back by the woman. No wonder there was the sound of clothes being dragged before. Eamon suppressed his wandering thoughts the moment they arose. These things were irrelevant now. The most important question was, how should he escape? He had a birthmark, which made him unsellable goods, so he might have his legs broken, eyes gouged out, and tongue cut off to be sold to beggars. Although this might be what the 2 idiots said to scare him, Eamon had seen such things often in his original world. Of course, at that time, he only viewed it as the confusing behavior of insects on the ground. After the 2 human traffickers checked that the restraints on the goods, hands and feet were still intact, they threw the 4 of them separately into the 4 corners of the room. Then the 2 left the room, and judging by the sound of their footsteps, they must have gone far away. However, Eamon dared not be careless. While listening carefully, trying to catch any breathing sounds other than the few people in the room, he cautiously struggled to free his wrists. Although the human traffickers' binding methods were professional, Amon's marauder inheritance contained a considerable number of escape techniques, from basic, topological rope escape, to actively loosening joints and twisting limbs, all readily available. After a burst of pain that made him cry, Eamon pulled his hand out of the rope and quickly reattached his wrist. In reality, Eamon had a tolerance for pain, but this body did not. The sensitive nerves and tear ducts seemed to have some connection, tears welled up the moment the pain occurred. Without wiping the tears from his face, Eamon quickly modified the knot, making the rope look the same as before, but in a state where he could untie and tie it at any time. Under the marauder's nimble hands, all of this happened remarkably quickly. In just 2 short minutes, he had completed the initial deal with of his hand and foot restraints. Although having something stuffed in his mouth was very uncomfortable, Eamon did not tear off the tape over his mouth. Instead, he quickly checked his personal belongings. His clothes were still the ordinary children's wear from the orphanage, but the candy and banknotes in his pocket had disappeared, and the fruit knife that had once severed two people's tendons was also gone. It seemed he had been searched once. However, Eamon rubbed the corner of his clothes vigorously a few times, and a slightly bent wire poked out. Good, at least something useful. Eamon put the wire back into his clothes, restored himself to his original state, and then began to inspect the room. The room was very spacious, with no windows and no furniture to speak of. There was only a soft chair placed by the door, which seemed to be where the man had rested earlier. There's almost nothing I can use. From the layout, it should be a storage room, but if it were an indoor storage room, the woman wouldn't have knocked on the door, and the man wouldn't have been so vigilant. So, this should be a relatively independent room. Similar to a small granary in a manor. Although Eamon was not proficient in mortal architecture, the Marauder's memories contained techniques for leaving doors ajar, picking locks, scouting locations, and observing. His escape from the orphanage also relied somewhat on this ability. This is troublesome. Now I'm likely in a room in some village or on the outskirts. If what that man said earlier wasn't intentionally for me to hear, there might really be no one around. In that case, even if I escape this room, it will be very difficult for me to return to the city and find a safe place. Indeed, he was unprepared. After losing his powerful strength, Eamon realized how much he relied on that power. Although he had once manipulated the current the fool in the palm of his hand, thinking carefully, the fact that the other party could contend with him in such a fragile state already indicated the gap in their cognitive abilities. Although at that time, he could still use excuses like, I never intended to get Saphira Castle immediately, or, my goal was actually deception, and the real target was Pales, to justify a few setbacks. Upon closer inspection, all he had done was rely on his power to oppress others. In contrast, the current the fool had come up with one escape plan after another in a short period. So that's it. Is it because he ascended step by step from a weak ant, having experienced a weak stage where he couldn't rely on power, that he can seize every opportunity? Eamon began to reflect on his shortcomings for the first time, starting to look for things to learn from the current the fool, whom he disliked, who had defeated him, and who had taken his beloved glasses. He felt that if it were that guy, he would definitely be able to escape from here, right? Eamon was thinking about how the current the fool would solve the current problem, but unfortunately, all he could think of were, Leodoro, and, just kill me. There was nothing he could do. By the time Eamon encountered him, he was already at sequence 4, and Eamon wasn't a miracle invoker, so he couldn't escape by committing suicide. No, those two sentences are just a facade, the key isn't there. Eamon tried to calm himself down, muttering as if self-hypnotizing. I need to think about the problem from a mortal's perspective, what mortals can use, what mortals would do. Although he thought this, Eamon didn't get any useful ideas, because he didn't know what mortals would do or think at all. He had never deeply studied these things that he could easily change. On the contrary, if he were to study how to scare people or play pranks, he might have some experience. Wait, scaring people. Amon's eyes suddenly narrowed, he felt like he had an idea. However, compared to back then, he didn't have such convenient Beyonder abilities now, and this world seemed to lack supernatural power, so those more crude methods might not be as effective. With these thoughts in mind, Eamon began to move stealthily around the room, constantly monitoring the unconscious children's movements, while also listening for approaching sounds outside the door. He didn't know if what he was doing was meaningful, but it was all he could do. Or rather, at such a time, only by keeping himself active could he calm down. Eamon had done things he didn't even know were meaningful in vain before. For example, he had once hidden his clone in Jacob's treasure for thousands of years, and also thrown a clone into the Chaos Sea's passage. But those were just clones, and now, Eamon had to do these things himself. His heart thumped uncontrollably, and he could clearly feel his hot blood rushing through his veins. The subtle sound of blood flowing now seemed as turbulent as waves, making it difficult for Eamon to even concentrate on listening for sounds outside the door. He knew he had to stop, but another voice seemed to urge him to complete the remaining homework. Thus, a fork in the road appeared before Eamon. For safety, temporarily stop work, but an incomplete arrangement, once noticed, would render all efforts futile. Or take a gamble, risking certain death if discovered, to complete an adventure he had no confidence in. If it were before, Eamon would definitely choose the former, because if he stopped now, even if the other party noticed something unusual, they would never suspect him. But now, he hesitated. To be precise, hesitation itself was a choice. The reason he made such an unwise decision was that Eamon felt that if the current the fool were standing here, he would definitely take a gamble. Courage, or should it be called recklessness? Eamon muttered self-mockingly, attributing this choice to the uncontrolled emotions of this body. But his hands never stopped. With the marauder's nimble movements, almost everything in the extremely crude warehouse was utilized by him. Huff, huff. It seems I gambled correctly. Not daring to wipe the sweat from his forehead, Eamon carefully retreated to his original position, restoring himself to a state of being tied up, blindfolded, and then quietly adjusted his breathing. Although it sounded like a long time, everything Eamon did took no more than half an hour. But this was the most thrilling half-hour Eamon had experienced in thousands of years. Even though his breathing had gradually calmed, Amon's heart was still pounding violently. It wasn't due to excessive exertion, but a feeling of stimulation mixed with excitement surging through his veins. Eamon constantly told himself that this was self-deception caused by the body's excessive tension. Eamon might not know what adrenaline was, but he should have some understanding of how people become mentally excited under fear, tension, etc., but he was still unable to suppress being affected by this feeling. Woo 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 woo. Suddenly, a faint but extremely piercing whimper, in Amon's concentrated ears, sounded beside him, subconsciously turning his head in the direction of the sound. Even with an eye mask still on his face, Eamon knew the source of this sound. It was the girl he had been tied up with by that man. She was now lying on the inner side of the warehouse, wanting to cry out loudly due to the unfamiliar environment and physical discomfort, but due to the rags in her mouth and the tape on her face, she could only emit faint, nasal whimpers. So annoying. Eamon was very annoyed by the timing of the girl waking up. With her struggles and whimpers, his hearing was greatly disturbed. But then, he abandoned the idea of secretly knocking the child out, or rather, her crying and fussing could attract the attention of the two human traffickers. Eamon didn't know how much these children were worth, but since they were prey the other party had captured at risk, they surely wouldn't be easily killed or abandoned. In this way, a child who was unconscious like a dead pig and a child who was constantly twisting, struggling, and making noise were completely different in terms of trouble. Cry, the more violently the better. Eamon mused, then simply closed his eyes, maintaining this very uncomfortable posture lying on the ground, and temporarily entered a state of meditation. Even if he had no Beander characteristic at all, meditation could still allow him to quickly enter a state of sleep. Quote exclamation mark exclamation mark exclamation mark quote. Eamon, who was sleeping very lightly, suddenly woke up. He forcibly suppressed the instinct to twist his body, keeping his somewhat numb, small body lying flat, and gently twitched his ears, catching every tiny sound. At this time, there was only faint breathing from the direction of the awakened little girl. Presumably her futile struggles earlier had exhausted her strength, while in the other two directions, the two breaths were somewhat different. One was relatively weak, intermittent, seemingly with a feeling that it could stop at any moment, but what Eamon was concerned about was the other one. That breath lacking undulation. This was not the state a person's normal breathing should have, let alone when both were still restrained. Not to mention a child, even an adult, if knocked out, gagged, and left on the ground for several hours, their breathing should become heavy and erratic. From this point alone, Eamon judged that this person should have already woken up. It seems like someone with a bit of a brain. I just hope he doesn't get too clever for his own good. Liang, how are things? Seeing her partner return, the female human trafficker put down her phone and asked. The police haven't made any major moves. I heard there was a murder in the old city, and now all police forces have been dispatched there, the man said with a hint of excitement on his face, speaking rapidly. Sister Chong, now is a great opportunity. Let's leave the city tonight. Sister Chong glared at Liang, annoyed. Idiot. The most taboo thing in our line of work is accidents, whether good or bad. This murder didn't happen earlier or later, but precisely at this time, which is already a bit suspicious. And use your brain to think, what kind of murder could tie up the entire city's police force? You mean it's a trap? No way. The murder was discovered this morning. We hadn't even made our move when it happened. Liang scratched his head, sounding very unconvinced. Sister Chong sighed, helpless. I didn't say it's a trap, just that there's a problem. While a typical murder is taken seriously, at most a few special task forces would be dispatched. The way this is being spread so widely, it might be a fishing expedition. And from another perspective, if this case is truly so big that it involves the entire city's police force, then even if it's to catch the killer, the exits from the city will definitely not be relaxed. Then what should we do? Liang's expression was a bit conflicted, but Sister Chong waved her hand and said. Just stick to the original plan. Wait a few more days and leave with the spring travel rush. With that kind of human traffic, even if they're trying to catch a killer, the police won't be able to block the roads for too long. Even if they want to investigate, they won't have the manpower. Plus, if this case is really that big, it won't be resolved in a few days. A few days earlier or later won't make a difference. Sister Chong's clear and logical answer immediately convinced Liang. Seeing her subordinate humbled by her wisdom, Sister Chong nodded with satisfaction. Her name actually didn't contain the character, Chong. In this line of work, even partners shouldn't casually reveal their real names. After all, in this era, there were identity and household registration systems. Revealing one's real name could easily lead the police to their origins and uncover more weaknesses. She took out her phone and searched for trending topics in the city, confirming there was news of a heinous crime. However, the details were all vague, with only some self-media claiming that even the police vomited after seeing the scene. Although there were some photos and videos, they were basically all scenes of police gathering, and they would quickly disappear after being posted. After a brief browse, Sister Chong closed her phone again, pinching her brow and saying, "Alright, go feed those little brats. Be gentle, don't leave obvious marks. After they eat, reapply the tape, and remove it 2 days before we leave, right, Sister Chong?" "It's not my first time doing this." Liang shook his head, but Sister Chong didn't mind, only telling him to hurry up. Liang didn't complain about Sister Chong delegating the small tasks to him. Although he was a bit dull, he wasn't stupid. He knew his own worth. If he left this business, plenty of people could replace him, but without Auntie Hong, he wouldn't last 2 jobs before getting caught. Picking up a kettle of water and a few blocks of compressed biscuits, whose expiration date was unknown, Liang got up and walked towards the warehouse. These things clearly wouldn't taste good, but he didn't care if those little brats could eat them or not. Or rather, it didn't matter if they couldn't eat them. In a couple of days, they would naturally fight over them. Moreover, for these goods, being full was more likely to cause problems. Being hungry for a couple of meals, with no energy, that was the best situation. "Are you little brats awake? If you are, squirm a bit." Liang opened the warehouse door, shouting loudly, while his eyes secretly scanned the positions of the 4 children, nodding with satisfaction. He could naturally tell that the children were still in their original positions, but for some reason, he felt a slight unease. This was a village within the city, in a rather remote location. It was said to be slated for real estate development, and everyone had already moved out with their relocation compensation. The 2 of them had chosen this remote spot as their temporary base. Although Sister Chong was always in the courtyard, Liang still had some vigilance. He continued to yell, as if trying to wake the children, while meticulously examining everything inside the warehouse. Because it was used to detain their captives, they had already tidied up most of the warehouse, leaving no place to hide a person, which made Liang slightly relieved. Even so, he still didn't ignore the unease. He walked over to the child closest to the door and ripped off the tape from his mouth. With a rip, the child let out a pained grunt, and then, as if realizing something, began to struggle violently. He desperately tried to spit out the cloth wad in his mouth, but before he succeeded, Liang slapped him hard on the butt. The loud sound of skin slapping and the muffled cry of pain from the blocked mouth echoed particularly loudly in the quiet warehouse, causing the girl who had already woken up in the back of the warehouse to let out a few faint whimpers. Looking at the snot-nosed kid, who was crying and snotting from his slap, Liang showed a disgusted expression. Actually, at this time, a slap to the face would have been the most intimidating method, but considering that they would be leaving the city soon, a swollen face would be problematic, so he changed to hitting a fleshier area. But no matter what, it still had some deterrent effect. "You guys don't understand nonsense anyway. In short, if you don't want a beating, then be obedient, shut up, don't make trouble. Do whatever I tell you to do. If anyone dares to cause trouble, I'll break his legs." Saying that, Liang also pulled out his belt and whipped it hard on the ground, producing a terrifying crisp sound. The child who had been pretending to sleep could no longer keep up the act. His body trembled slightly, seemingly frightened by the situation. Eamon, who had been worried about a pig teammate, now felt relieved, knowing that fear meant he wouldn't do anything counterproductive. Seeing that none of the 4 children were making trouble, Liang's mood improved. He casually broke off a small piece of compressed biscuit and stuffed it into the mouth of the child he had just slapped. Without another word, he walked towards the next child. Eamon, as the last one to be given a biscuit, was somewhat resistant to the disgusting taste in his mouth, but he forced himself to chew and swallow it. He had understood during his escape from the orphanage that with his current body, he couldn't do anything without eating. Seeing some children chew a couple of bites and then spit out the biscuit, Liang didn't care. He placed the kettle on the ground and sat down on the seat by the door. But as he sat down, Liang suddenly frowned. Liang frowned, not because he noticed anything amiss, but because as he sat down, he felt a vague sense of unfamiliarity. This feeling wasn't obvious, it was like a pen you'd used for years suddenly felt awkward in your hand. But his current feeling wasn't that severe. After all, he hadn't lived in this small courtyard for very long. He leaned back slightly, but the unfamiliarity didn't disappear. Liang immediately felt a chill. He scratched his back, got up, and looked at a few other children who were quietly huddled, but still found no change. Is it because these little devils woke up? The man thought, and immediately glared. The little girl he glared at instantly flinched back and burst into tears. Shut up! The man roared, his voice so loud that the little girl was momentarily startled, choking back her cries in her throat, letting out several painful coughs before finally recovering. Nothing wrong, right? The man turned to look at the remaining children, who all had cowering, fearful eyes, which reassured Liang. But when he sat down again, that strange sense of unfamiliarity surged over him once more. Something's wrong. Very wrong. Liang suddenly jumped up and paced back and forth in the warehouse, as if searching for the culprit that made him uneasy. But ultimately, the warehouse was only so big, most of the items inside had been cleared out, and the remaining things, like iron frames welded to the ground, which were difficult to move, could be seen at a glance. He had already inspected this warehouse several times before finally using it as a temporary detention place for goods, so he knew exactly how every part should be. But it was precisely this understanding that made him increasingly uneasy when everything appeared to be perfectly fine. Damn it! An increasingly agitated Liang uttered a classic expletive and turned to walk towards the door. However, halfway there, he turned back and taped the mouths of each child, one by one, before picking up the kettle and heading out. The longer one worked in this line of business, the less one could underestimate the combat power of children, as there were indeed colleagues who had died because they gave them a fork, a chopstick, or forgot to tape their mouths. Cheng wasn't very bright, but at least he knew that to live long, one had to be cautious. Watching Liang leave the warehouse, Eamon let out a long sigh of relief. The first step had temporarily gone without a hitch. Although he himself doubted whether the subsequent steps would go smoothly, since he had already started, he could only continue to gamble. These are just ordinary people. If I were to encounter an extraordinary person, I really don't know what I would do. A thought that Eamon would never have originally conceived surfaced in his mind, because in a short period of time, he had already begun to place himself on the weaker side. Once stripped of power and backing, a mischievous child will realize he can only rely on himself. No matter how incorrigible he is, as long as he clearly recognizes this point, he will immediately change his code of conduct. The unscrupulous, inhumane, and merciless Eamon, upon realizing his own weakness and helplessness, unhesitatingly discarded his pride. Or rather, his so-called pride was merely a false impression given by the indifference of someone possessing great power, because originally, he didn't even have pride, it was just a natural temperament born from his living environment. Environment molds temperament, and sustenance shapes the body, that is the principle. Just as Eamon was pondering how to proceed, the warehouse once again began to echo with intermittent sobs. The muffled, nasal cries, caused by their mouths being taped shut, greatly annoyed him. But he had no intention of speaking. Let alone a group of children, even a few adults would find it difficult to maintain their integrity among those who would betray their own kind for relatively better treatment. He could only huddle in a corner, conserving his energy while mimicking their intermittent whimpers. Although he didn't know if those children still cared about such things, Eamon at this moment felt he needed to be careful with every detail. Yes, just like the current the fool, the preparation work must be done perfectly. At this moment, Sister Chong was standing at the courtyard door, holding a bowl, eating and keeping watch. Just as she slurped down a mouthful of noodles, she heard Liang's frantic shouts from behind. Sister Chong, what is it? Sister Chong frowned and put down her bowl and chopsticks. Your food is in the kitchen, go get it yourself. It's not that. Liang took a few deep breaths, then said. I feel like that warehouse is a bit off. Off? How is it off? Sister Chong's frown deepened, but she finally became vigilant. In their line of work, those who weren't vigilant usually ended up in jail. The only thing to be thankful for was that, due to their carelessness, those guys usually didn't do many deals and only spent a few years in prison if caught. But for someone like her, getting caught usually meant a bullet. I can't quite explain it, but it just feels very strange. Liang said immediately when he saw Sister Chong clearly taking it seriously, but the more he spoke, the weaker his tone became. Very strange. Sister Chong didn't express dissatisfaction at such a vague statement, or rather, sometimes intuition was far more reliable than clues. I can't quite explain it, but it's that feeling, like someone has been here. Yes, that's the feeling. But I've checked, nothing has been moved, the children haven't made a sound, and this little device hasn't detected any listening devices or anything like that. Chang said, also pulling out a palm-sized device from his pocket. This was an anti-eavesdropping and surveillance device bought on Taobao. Although cheap, it was actually quite effective. Let's go take a look. Sister Chong pondered for a moment, then without a word, she picked up a wooden club from by the courtyard wall and walked towards the warehouse with a serious expression. Seeing this, Liang immediately picked up a wooden stick and followed alongside her. I've checked, there's no one hiding, and there's no place to hide anyone in that warehouse. I know. Sister Chong glared at Liang. Was she supposed to say that carrying the club was for courage? The courtyard door was not far from the warehouse. The two quickly arrived at the door. They did not rush to enter, but instead approached the door and listened quietly. Behind the door, it was clearly very quiet, only intermittent, nasal sobs, and the sound was very faint, as if they had cried themselves out. No problem. The experienced Sister Chong immediately judged that the crying was not faked. She gave Liang a look, and Liang immediately pushed open the door. The two then slipped into the warehouse. Sister Chong and Liang didn't find any problems in the end, but that strange feeling lingered. At first, it was confined to the warehouse, but as time went on, that sense of unease spread outwards. As human traffickers, Sister Chong and Liang were very clear about the nature of their work. As the saying goes, those who do no wrong fear no knock at the door. The reverse is also true. If one does too many bad deeds, most people, except for a very few born evil, will feel some unease. And Eamon precisely exploited this unease. What he did, if one were to describe it, was actually very simple. He fine-tuned the positions of some things. Human senses are sometimes more acute than one can imagine. Even differences that the eyes cannot discern can cause subconscious discomfort, such as a slightly adjusted chair, a mouse with a slightly altered frame rate, or a picture frame tilted 1 degree to the left. All these things can make a person feel a subtle unease when they settle down. Don't say humans can't feel it. A skilled fitter can detect subtle errors by touch that a robot would take a long time to check. The human body is much more miraculous than you think. Of course, this fine-tuning couldn't be overdone, or it would be directly noticed. Only Eamon, a swindler for thousands of years, a god of pranks who deeply understood how to scare people, could accomplish such a setup with the ultimate dexterity of a marauder's hands. As Sister Chong and Liang's mental state deteriorated day by day, Eamon began to gain more time to operate. And when the two finally couldn't bear it any longer, attributing everything to the warehouse being unclean, and confining the 4 children in different locations, Eamon finally got what he needed, a private space where he didn't have to worry about the other 3 children. At 3 in the morning, the deepest hour of human sleep, Eamon, lying on a pile of straw, suddenly opened his eyes. In the past few days, he had roughly explored the surroundings of this small courtyard. However, the 2 human traffickers had set up many traps around. Although with his knowledge and observation skills, he wouldn't be stumped by those small bells and such, as a 6 or 7-year-old child, he couldn't guarantee that he could return quickly after going out. But now it was different. He had already assessed the surrounding road conditions with his excellent eyesight, forming a small map in his mind. While it didn't guarantee escape, finding a forest, ruins, or similar place to hide wouldn't be too difficult. Quickly untying the ropes on his hands and feet, Eamon tiptoed to the door, pressed his ear against it, and quietly listened to the surroundings. This time, he had no thoughts of revenge. Unlike the previous 2 thieves, these human traffickers were quite alert. If he had the power of a complete marauder, even just a sequence 9, he would be confident in dealing with them. But now, he was just a 6 or 7-year-old child, with no confidence in approaching those scoundrels silently. Thump, thump, thump. A series of footsteps suddenly sounded, and Amon's expression changed abruptly. He quickly retreated to the straw, and in just over 10 seconds, he had retied himself. This time, he didn't even leave a loose end to easily untie himself. After all, under the mental torment of these days, Liang and Sister Chong both showed symptoms of mental exhaustion. Although their sleep was light at night, they wouldn't have the energy to stand guard. But now that someone was up, it definitely wasn't as simple as getting up in the middle of the night to use the toilet. Was there an accident? Or did I leave a flaw somewhere? Eamon constantly recalled his actions over the past few days, trying to find where he had been insufficiently cautious, and secretly regretting not escaping yesterday, even if the probability of a successful escape last night was 30% lower than today. Bang! The door was suddenly pushed open. Eamon dared not look up, only quietly listening to the sound approaching, and slowly relaxing his muscles to ensure he could unleash a strike with all his strength in an instant. The footsteps stopped beside Eamon. Judging by the rhythm of the steps, it should be Sister Chong and not a Liang, but this didn't make Eamon feel much better. Even if it was a woman, with his physical condition, it would be difficult to kill her directly. On the contrary, compared to the somewhat dull A Liang, the woman called Sister Chong was even more troublesome. Suddenly, a familiar scent was caught by Eamon. He instantly understood what the other party intended to do and immediately held his breath. The next moment, a slightly damp handkerchief covered his face. Eamon immediately gave a slight struggle as if waking up, then slowly lost strength and slumped down. Sister Chong did not relax because of this. She kept the handkerchief on for a few more seconds before slowly releasing it, picking up Eamon, and walking towards the door. "She's carrying me." Eamon felt extremely helpless about his current posture. If he were being carried on her back, he could easily achieve a one-hit kill by attacking vital points like the carotid sinus. But now, he even had to maintain all his attention on his body's movements to ensure he appeared to be genuinely unconscious, rather than faking it. Under Amon's exquisite body control, Sister Chong didn't realize that the brat she was carrying wasn't actually unconscious. She came all the way to the back of the courtyard, where Liang was putting one boy and one girl into suitcases. "Remember to keep their faces towards the zipper, it would be a huge loss if they suffocated." Sister Chong rubbed her heavy dark circles, casually instructing. Liang also looked a bit tired and nodded, saying, "I understand." Sister Chong had no mood for further talk. She also picked up a large suitcase, stuffed Eamon inside, and as the zipper closed, Eamon felt a jolt. The sound of a car engine, along with the bumpy sensation, entered the suitcase. Eamon felt an immense sorrow. He had finally weakened the human traffickers, spirits, finally completed the environmental reconnaissance. He was so close, just one more day, and he could have successfully escaped. He had not made a single wrong step, yet he still failed. Everything he had done before seemed to have been in vain. At this moment, Eamon suddenly remembered a line from some scoundrel's novel. "Humans have limits. The more cunning one is, the more likely one is to make mistakes in unexpected places." Damn it! Eamon could only rage in his heart, but for some reason, the figure of the current the fool once again appeared in his mind. Back in the forsaken land of the gods, when he teased him, repeatedly exposing his plans just when he gained hope of escape, did he feel the same way he did now? "No, that guy managed to endure it, there's no reason I can't. They're just two mortals." Chapter 30 Amon's Great Adventure 10. After some mental preparation, Eamon finally suppressed the urge to cry from his weak body. He carefully took a breath, steadied his emotions, and suppressed the dizziness caused by the bumps. Sister Chong and A Liang, however, seemed quite calm at this moment. At least on the surface, everything appeared normal, except for a slight listlessness. However, mental listlessness was actually normal, as people driving home at this time of year always seemed a bit off mentally, not because of fatigue driving, but because of irregular rest caused by traffic jams. And for some reason, they didn't put all 4 children in the luggage compartment. Instead, one was left outside, lying in a very casual posture on the bed formed by the back seat in the luggage compartment, looking as if he had fallen asleep among the luggage due to exhaustion, referencing the beginning of Spirited Away. The vehicle moved slowly, but what concerned Sister Chong and Liang was that police still appeared on the road from time to time. However, both of them were experienced individuals. Their honest demeanor, coupled with the fatigue caused by neurasthenia, made it difficult even for the old police officer to detect any issues with their temperament. The car slowly advanced along the road. Even though it was early morning, the highway out of the city was still a bit congested. Or rather, it was precisely because they anticipated traffic jams that everyone chose to leave at this time, which ironically led to earlier congestion. Of course, all of this was within Sister Chong and A Liang's expectations. Through several days of reconnaissance and years of experience, they accurately judged the severity of traffic at this time. Only this way could their trip seem less abrupt. Moreover, at this time, even police and checkpoint personnel couldn't resist physiological fatigue, and with the large number of people, the probability of being discovered was much smaller. Especially the child, who was the finishing touch. Having the child openly sleeping in the car greatly reduced the risk of suspicion, and the luggage compartment, pressed by the sleeping child, would most likely not be randomly inspected. Eamon was locked in the luggage compartment, listening to the noisy sounds outside and considering whether to suddenly jump out and scream to attract attention. But he quickly abandoned this idea because he couldn't be sure of the specific conduct of the police in this world, nor did he know if the 2 traffickers had already arranged everything. After all, Eamon knew what the sheriff in his original world was like. Calling him a rich man's dog was not an exaggeration at all. If it was the same here, opening his mouth would be suicide. Endure. Eamon suppressed the impulse in his heart. At the same time, he also realized another one of his shortcomings: he didn't know when to be reckless and when to be timid. Although he might not understand the meaning of these two words, he did have the corresponding concepts. Unlike Klein, Eamon was born with immense strength and unparalleled backing, which meant he never had to consider the disparity between himself and his enemies. So, he appeared to be a carefree person who was reckless or timid on a whim, but in reality, he was just wildly reckless. And when he lost his backing and his power, his timid side would emerge. He would hesitate, fearing that his choices would put him in danger, and this hesitation was the core reason he had missed opportunities so many times now. Given Amon's intelligence, he had, of course, realized this point, but some things cannot be solved by simply realizing them. After all, Eamon currently lacked even the most basic understanding. In a sense, him being thrown into a child's body was quite fitting, because if his power and backing were excluded, then his decision-making ability when facing danger was truly not much better than that of an ordinary child. As a weakling, Eamon still had many things to learn, but the problem was that he had to face almost unbeatable opponents before he could learn all of it. Eamon suddenly felt that perhaps his rash escape from the orphanage was not a good choice. Although it was likely a cage built by his father, there was no doubt that by staying there, he would at least not face death. The not too large private car slowly started moving again, which meant it had initially escaped the traffic jam and also meant that Eamon had once again lost an opportunity to call for help. About an hour, or an hour and a half later, faint whimpering began to sound. Eamon realized that the drug they had given had worn off, but the other party didn't seem to make any moves, just chatted listlessly while steadily driving the car. Eamon didn't know that parking was not allowed on highways in this world, nor did he know that there were surveillance cameras on highways. Therefore, he naturally concluded that they had now entered the other party's script, and only then would the other party be so fearless. However, Sister Chong and a Liang were not as relaxed as Eamon thought. Even though they had done this several times before, they still couldn't help but tense their nerves at this moment. Both a Liang and Sister Chong would occasionally check the situation in the back seat through the rearview mirror. After all, the three children in the boxes were fine, but the one on the car seat had no restraints whatsoever. But it was precisely because this child lying on the car seat was especially important that they chose the weakest acting kid these past few days. The most cunning Eamon, on the other hand, was placed by them at the innermost side of the luggage compartment, so even if he wanted to cause trouble, he would have to push away the luggage compartments weighing down two children, as well as the child whose half-body was pressing on the luggage compartment. However, everything proceeded according to plan. Both the child on the car seat and the kids in the luggage compartment remained quite obedient, which significantly improved Liang's mood. Sister Chong, where are we delivering the goods this time? Exit the highway at the next fork. As with previous times, Sister Chong did not directly state the specific location but instead gave detailed directions. Liang had no objections to this. He didn't have much extra thought and knew he wasn't the type to strategize. Following Sister Chong's instructions, he exited the highway, and after several twists and turns, they arrived in front of a residential building. Curled up inside the luggage compartment, Eamon felt a strong jolt, followed by a dull pain. Although separated by the luggage compartment, the sensation of being thrown still truly impacted him. Is this the destination? Is it the buyer's territory? Or a temporary resting place? In Amon's rope-bound hands, there was a wire. This time, he had made up his mind. No matter what, he would absolutely not miss another opportunity. A ripping sound, the zipper being opened, accompanied by a somewhat dazzling light. Eamon, who was curled up, was directly lifted. Before he could adapt to the light and observe his surroundings, he was thrown to the side on the ground. Immediately after, he heard Liang's voice say, "If you don't want to be punished, then behave yourself. From now on, you won't have the good treatment you had before. If anyone dares to cause trouble, I'll break your limbs and sell you to beggars. I'm talking about all of you. If even one person disobeys, everyone will be crippled." Tisk! Eamon immediately had a bad feeling. He rubbed his eyes hard, but only heard a muffled thud. In this small room, only 4 children remained. It looks like a stronghold. The most troublesome situation has occurred. Eamon sighed, not trying to untie his hands, but quietly observing the other 3 and imitating them. This was not a difficult thing. In fact, the reason Eamon found it troublesome was because the current environment was completely different from before. That courtyard was just a temporary stopping point, but this place was different. Looking at the door with the inner handle already removed, and the lack of any sharp edges in the room, he knew this place must have been prepared in advance. According to Liang's inquiries for directions earlier, this place shouldn't have been prepared by the two of them together. At least a Liang shouldn't have known about it. But looking at his methods, he doesn't seem like a novice. Eamon tried to calm himself, while also thinking about all the clues he could grasp, trying to relink them. He had no intention of repeating his old tricks. It wasn't that the same technique couldn't be used in this kind of house, nor was it because of the collective punishment for a few children. Rather, he was worried there might be surveillance cameras here. This was the first time Eamon thanked those two thieves. At least they told him that this world had surveillance that even ordinary people could use. Otherwise, he might very well die an unexplained death. I don't know if these human traffickers just do an occasional job, or if they're selling people all year round in various places. If it's the former, then Sister Chong would have plenty of time to set up safe houses herself. If it's the latter, then this place should be provided by the buyer or the broker. Eamon rationally judged the situation, pondering what his fate would be if he fell into the hands of a broker. After all, the birthmark on his eye was itself a problem. Whether anyone would buy him was an issue. Damn it, if it weren't for this thing, I would just wait to be sold. Anyway, buyers are definitely easier to deal with than human traffickers. Eamon muttered to himself, but then suddenly looked up, because he saw the girl whose hands and feet were not tied, actually starting to untie the others. Is this person an idiot? Eamon felt a little speechless for a moment. The human traffickers had said not to cause trouble. Who knew if untying ropes counted as causing trouble? However, this little girl and the other two children obviously didn't realize such a danger. Instead, they preferred to spend time crying. Listening to the continuous crying all around, and the girl who walked over to him and started untying his ropes, Eamon sighed and didn't refuse. If the human traffickers really intended collective punishment, then everything was already decided. He could only try to fight back when they made their move, to see if he could kill one or two of them. If the human traffickers didn't consider this causing trouble, or if they planned to use this girl as a tool to establish their authority, then he would be fine. On the contrary, if he refused to be untied, that would seem strange. And strangeness could very likely increase the human traffickers' attention. Perhaps, to avoid accidents, they might just kill him directly. Thinking this, Eamon regained his freedom, but he didn't cry. He just calmly looked at the little girl in front of him and said, "You untied our ropes. Aren't you afraid of being crippled and thrown to beggars?" Quote. Instantly, the crying in the room stopped abruptly. The expression of fear was overwhelmed by genuine terror. Only then did they realize the potential price they might face for being untied. "It's all your fault. Why did you untie the ropes for no reason?" The youngest-looking boy immediately glared at the girl who untied the ropes and said. The other little girl, hearing this, immediately said, "Yes, it's all your fault. I just thought." The girl who untied the ropes was suddenly at a loss, while Eamon completely disregarded their emotions. He just watched the ugly faces of the two brats, who immediately shifted blame when something happened, while thinking about what he should do next. Given the current state of these two, he would have to be careful with whatever he did. And the one who untied the ropes was also brainless. He couldn't expect any clever moves from her. Just as Eamon was sighing over his bleak future and looking for items with greater lethality, the girl suddenly seemed to think of something and said, "It's okay, they won't really cripple us." "How do you know?" Eamon unexpectedly glanced at the little girl, a slight cold smile in his heart, deliberately offering her a chance. In reality, he highly doubted this girl, doubted those two human traffickers, and even doubted everyone around him, believing it was all orchestrated by someone. Although he hadn't noticed anything discordant, missing the opportunity was his own choice, and even if he was just an ordinary person now, his former status as a true god of the dual pathway was enough to ensure that when he was being manipulated, even if he couldn't resist, he would at least have some premonition. But who knew if his own father had updated his methods of arrangement? One must always remain vigilant, mustn't one? As long as this girl said something that didn't fit her identity and knowledge, it could basically be determined that the other party was disguised by someone. And if her words matched her identity but were too coincidental, then it could be determined that she was arranged by fate or the spectator pathway. The little girl got Amon's prompting, and finally breathed a sigh of relief. Facing the questioning and condemning gazes of the other two, she said somewhat timidly, "They are human traffickers, they caught us to sell for money. How much money can beggars have? My dad said when he buys toys that damaged boxes are much cheaper than perfect ones. If it's like that for boxes, then disabled people definitely aren't as valuable as healthy children. Dad buys toys. You can't even find a good excuse to lie." Eamon rolled his eyes inwardly, but then noticed a term, box damage. What was that? From the little girl's meaning, it was the packaging box. If the packaging box was damaged, the product would have to be discounted. What kind of logic was this? Were you selling the box or the item inside? However, the two children seemed to accept this reasoning. What kind of logic was this after all? Although a reasonable explanation was given that everyone, except Eamon, could accept, it wasn't enough to dispel the unease the human traffickers had caused. In reality, the source of this unease wasn't the previous threats, but the time they had wasted in this confined space. Previously, when they were locked in the warehouse, or separately in small rooms, even though they had to face fear and loneliness alone, it was still a solitary experience. Children, by nature, possess a strange characteristic of becoming stronger when they have no one to rely on. When there's no one around to depend on, children will pick themselves up after a fall. But if parents, friends, or even just one or two acquaintances are nearby, they will cry uncontrollably. This might not be a conscious act, but in terms of outcome, it is undoubtedly universal. At least all the 7 or 8-year-old children the author has seen are like this. Although these children weren't acquaintances, as time passed, a subconscious, kinship, mentality began to spread, accompanied by a growing sense of panic among them. Fear is contagious. Eamon saw through all of this very clearly. In fact, he had used this escalating sense of fear to terrify many people, including those of mid to high sequence. But when Eamon himself was in such an environment, he truly understood what kind of torment this was. Click, according to Amon's internal clock, it was nearing evening. Just as the kids started to panic that the traffickers intended to starve them, the door, whose inner handle had been removed, suddenly opened. A Liang walked in, carrying a bag of compressed biscuits. Eamon clearly felt the three children sigh with varying degrees of relief, but his mood was far from pleasant. As a seasoned swindler, how could he not understand that this was a tactic of alternating high pressure and relaxation to lower their guard and willpower? Is this kind of tactic necessary for 4 children under 10? Eamon kept his mouth tightly shut, as if still sealed. What the girl said earlier was quite reasonable. Since they were merchandise, there was no reason to sell their goods cheaply. But Eamon knew very well that he was not on the list of premium merchandise. So, if possible, he had to minimize his presence, lest he, this defective product, become the chicken used to scare the monkeys. A Liang stepped through the door, looked at the children whose ropes had been untied, and raised an eyebrow but said nothing. He simply placed a bag of biscuits and several disposable paper cups on the table, then slowly began to pour water. Seeing the torn open compressed biscuits, the children couldn't help but swallow. Days ago, this soap-like stuff was not something they could swallow. But now, after this period of sustained hunger, they had completely abandoned that idea. As long as it filled their stomachs, nothing else mattered. Eamon looked at the biscuits, forcefully suppressing the ferocious expression that was about to appear on his face. Compared to these children, his consumption over the past few days was far from satisfied by a few biscuits. After receiving his share of biscuits and water, his gaze still lingered on those A Liang had tucked into his pocket, and, well, the few pieces given to the other children. Only when you are full and hydrated do you have the energy to escape. But Eamon knew he couldn't act. If he were to categorize these 4 children, Eamon was certain he was the lowest tier. Although he didn't know the market price for child trafficking in this world, or which type of child was more sought after, there was no doubt that someone like him with a birthmark was probably only slightly better than those who were disabled or sick. Damn the fool. Damn old man. Eamon cursed inwardly again, grinding the biscuits in his hand with small bites, like a hamster, allowing them to mix thoroughly with water to provide a greater sense of fullness. A Liang looked at the children without saying much, picked up the kettle, and turned to leave the room. How are they? Seeing a Liang emerge, Sister Chong, sitting in the living room, asked casually, peeling an apple. A Liang placed the kettle aside and spread his hands. Can't you see? I'm asking you now. Sister Chong glared, and a Liang immediately conceded. The one who untied the ropes is quite clever and hasn't been antagonized by the others. The little one with dark circles under his eyes is also stable. Is that so? Sister Chong nodded, pondered for a moment, then said, I still feel uneasy. What are you afraid of? The goods will be sold tomorrow. I guess that yard isn't very clean, or maybe we've just been a bit tired lately. After we split the money this time, we can go back and rest for a couple of days. Slap. Before Liang could finish speaking, Sister Chong slapped him, leaving him a bit stunned. But before he could react, he saw Auntie Hong staring at him with an extremely angry look, saying, What did I tell you before? When doing this line of work, watch your mouth. How could I? A Liang wanted to argue a bit more, but then his mind spun, and he realized that what he had just said was indeed a bit inauspicious. He immediately shut his mouth, said no more, and even slapped himself. Eamon lay casually on the floor, quietly staring at the ceiling. This room was completely a cage, without even a window, and even with only 4 children, it still made one feel stifled. But what was even more depressing was, FCK. Eamon hadn't learned much else since coming to Earth, but he had picked up a lot of curses. He cursed softly and got up, walking towards the lidded plastic spittoon in the corner. This was where the 4 children took care of their personal needs in this room. Fortunately, due to insufficient food and water supply, the children had little desire to use the toilet. Unfortunately, under these circumstances, if one did need to use the toilet, the smell was quite strong. Even though Eamon was once a true god of 2 pathways, he could not fight the instincts of this body. He sat on that foul-smelling contraption with immense frustration, quickly emptying his bowels. This toilet didn't even have a curtain. Under the intentional or unintentional gazes of the 3 children, Eamon felt himself enveloped by an intense sense of humiliation. He gritted his teeth, quickly pulled up his pants, and for a moment, he even wanted to directly unlock the door and rush out to fight those 2 bastards. I must endure, I must endure. IFC King have to endure. Eamon mumbled the curses he had learned from the Marauder, feeling his mood lighten slightly. He quickly put the lid back on the spittoon and retreated to his original corner, suddenly feeling a little damp around his eyes. Eamon, the son of the ancient sun god, the god of deception, the god of pranks, the heir who manipulates time and fate, the nightmare of all marauders, at this moment, shed the first tear of his thousands of years of godly life. Eamon gritted his teeth for what felt like the umpteenth time, suppressing the urge to chant the honorific name. Although he knew very well that even if he changed worlds, as long as he chanted the honorific name according to the rules, at least the current the fool and his own father would definitely sense it. But he still suppressed this weak thought. It wasn't because of so-called self-respect. That kind of thing had long been thrown to the winds when he was huddled in a room with a few children, defecating and urinating. The reason he didn't act on this thought was that he clearly knew neither the current the fool nor his own father would offer him help. They might kill a couple of human traffickers later, and they might rescue those little brats, but for him, all of this was a form of punishment. Eamon wouldn't do such a thankless thing. If he could, he would rather these 2 human traffickers live forever, and then he would return to give them the cruelest punishment. After a round of self-consolation, along the lines of, "I'll get you when I'm rich," Eamon finally fell asleep. With a high probability of surveillance, he didn't plan to cause trouble. Or rather, letting the 2 human traffickers believe he had completely detached from the supernatural, and fallen asleep peacefully, then acting, would achieve a better effect. The night passed without incident. Sister Chong, who hadn't slept so soundly in a long time, was startled to find she had slept too soundly. She immediately woke up a Liang next door. Like her, after a long period of neurasthenia, he too had slept very deeply. The 2 exchanged glances, and an ominous thought immediately arose. Instead of rashly going to the room where the children were held, they immediately checked the surveillance footage. In the surveillance, the 4 children were sound asleep, though tear stains remained on their faces. The clock in the room was synchronized with the current time, clearly not a recording or anything similar. Seeing this, a Liang and Sister Chong slightly relaxed. She pulled out her phone and simultaneously said to a Liang, "Although it was just a false alarm, still check the previous surveillance footage. I'll contact the buyer." Understood. A Liang didn't argue and immediately skillfully operated the computer, beginning to review last night's footage. Although he wasn't the brightest, modern equipment emphasized user-friendliness, so even he could skillfully perform these operations. It wasn't harder than downloading movies from foreign websites. Unfortunately, Eamon missed this optimal opportunity last night again. He didn't do anything. So, half an hour later, several men wearing balaclavas, led by Sister Chong and A Liang, arrived at the place where the children were being held. We acquired 4 this time, 2 boys and 2 girls, all very clever. Their original families shouldn't have much background, though one has a birthmark. But he's from an orphanage, so no one should come looking for him. Sister Chong quickly introduced the kidnapped children, not forgetting to mention Amon's flaw in advance to avoid an awkward situation during inspection. The leader of the masked men didn't care about this. He shook his head and said, "Let's see them first." With that, the door, whose inner handle had been removed and lock reversed, was opened, and immediately, a peculiar smell wafted from the room. However, neither Sister Chong, a Liang, nor the 3 who arrived later showed any particular emotion. After scanning the scene in the room, he nodded and said to the person beside him, "Check them." "Okay." The respondent opened a briefcase, took out various medical instruments and common infectious disease test strips, and began examining them one by one. Eamon watched as the 4 children, including himself, were examined like livestock. The men in his heart grew stronger. He glanced at the masked man who was the leader but abandoned the idea of taking a hostage. Firstly, the other party was just a buyer. Secondly, there was another masked man behind him. Even without his Beyonder abilities, Amon's keen spiritual perception could still provide warnings. At least for his current self, the masked man, presumably a bodyguard, possessed a powerful strength he couldn't resist. The various examinations took about half an hour. The masked man who was the doctor turned and returned to the side of the leader masked man, nodding slightly. The leader masked man turned to look at Sister Chong and A Liang, saying in a rather casual tone. Same old rule, 50% up front. If no genetic diseases or other issues are found later, we'll pay the rest. No problem, you call the shots. Sister Chong immediately nodded upon hearing this, while Eamon continuously watched the leader masked man out of the corner of his eye, his emotions extremely complex, unsure whether he hoped to be bought by the other party or not. After all, the other party's demeanor was clearly not on the same level as Sister Chong's. Escaping from their hands would obviously be much more difficult than escaping from Auntie Hong's hands. But conversely, the other party shouldn't be the end buyer, but rather a broker-like figure. Once in their hands, he would most likely be sold to a client, which clearly represented more possibilities for escape. Just as Eamon was conflicted, the masked man suddenly seemed to remember something and said to Sister Chong. Oh, and I don't want the kid with the dark circles. That one, we'll just throw him in. Sister Chong immediately started to speak, but her words were cut off by the other party. I said I don't want him, and I don't. Okay. Sister Chong immediately shut up. After settling the payment with the man, she and Liang took the 3 children downstairs. For a moment, Eamon was left alone in the room, accompanied only by the chamber pot. An opportunity. Eamon immediately realized this was a rare chance. At this moment, Liang and Sister Chong were both helping to move the people, which meant that there should be no one at the door of the room. The only question was how long it would take for this door to leave their sight. Fortunately, Eamon had feigned sleep when he first arrived here. By calculating footsteps and time, he had roughly gathered some intelligence about the room's location. Counting the time in his head, he pulled out the iron wire that had been with him for a long time from his clothes. The marauder's nimble wrist displayed unprecedented speed. He stepped on the plastic chamber pot, allowing himself to barely reach the doorknob. Picking the lock took almost no time at all. He ignored the chamber pot, simply closed the door, and then began to run down the corridor. The marauder's agility meant he made no sound, but he clearly didn't intend to go directly to the exit. He knew very well that those people must be outside the door right now. Whether jumping out the window or going through the door, it was very likely to expose himself to their sight. More importantly, he had been hungry for a long time, and his physical strength would definitely not support his escape. Without understanding the surrounding environment, he would quickly be caught. So, the only option was to fight back. What should we do with that kid who couldn't be sold? Back in the house, Liang asked Sister Chong in a requesting tone. Sister Chong shook her head and said, I'll make a call later and ask if there are any families in the remote mountain villages who need a son. If not, we'll just sell him to a beggar at a low price. But we'll have to travel far, and it'll take half a month, not including travel expenses. Tisk, it's all your fault for bringing back this money pit. It's my fault, Liang said with a forced smile, but he didn't dare to say he would handle it himself. Firstly, he was worried Sister Chong would suspect he was trying to use this to establish his own channels. Secondly, he also felt he couldn't handle such a matter. Sister Chong saw that Liang's attitude in admitting his mistake was good, and her expression softened a little. She nodded, raised her hand to look at her watch, and then said, Go check on that kid's condition. If there's no problem, give him something to eat. We'll set off tonight. Isn't that a bit too rushed? Liang frowned. He had just managed to get a good night's sleep, and now they had to leave again. Rushed. If I wasn't worried that continuous medication would turn that kid into an idiot, I'd want to leave right now. Sister Chong glared at A Liang with an unhappy expression, then pointed at the calendar on the wall and said, Look at the time clearly. In 2 more days, the return to work tide will almost be over. Do you think it will be as easy for us to pass through checkpoints then as it is now? Upon hearing this, Liang slapped his head hard and said helplessly, I haven't slept well these past few days, my mind's all muddled. I'll go deliver food to that kid now. He said food, but Liang still casually grabbed half a pack of compressed biscuits. These were cheap and filling, and most importantly, they didn't require utensils. No matter how extraordinary a kid was, he couldn't possibly injure him with just a paper cup and a few biscuits. Don't think he was cowardly. In fact, Sister Chong's previous partner was secretly killed by a kid with a fork. Of course, perhaps it was an accident that the unlucky guy fell and hit the fork. Anyway, for Liang, whether it was an accident or not, he didn't want to experience it. Click. As the reverse-installed door lock twisted, the door was pushed open, followed by a foul smell. Liang's face immediately darkened. He thought the kid had knocked over the spittoon and was about to scold him, but then he realized there was no sign of the kid in the room. Liang didn't check the room immediately. Instead, he immediately re-locked the door and then ran all the way downstairs. Compared to being ambushed by a kid who might or might not be hiding in the room, he felt checking the surveillance was a safer option. Are you running so fast you're rushing to reincarnate? Watching Liang run down, Sister Chong scolded him with dissatisfaction, but Liang shook his head, out of breath, and said, Sister Chong, that kid ran away. Ran away. Sister Chong's face immediately changed. She rushed to the computer and started typing rapidly. Soon, the surveillance footage from the room was brought up. The sight of the kid opening the door lock in almost an instant made her feel as if she had fallen into an ice cellar. Is this kid a craftsman? Slang for thief. An experienced thief is called a Buddha. Liang muttered with a frown, but Auntie Hong suddenly stood up and said, Quick, search. We haven't gone far, he can't have escaped. He must still be in the house. I'll go outside and watch to prevent him from climbing the wall. Got it. Before Sister Chong even spoke, Liang had already picked up the baseball bat placed under the table. This was, after all, a place for transactions, and surveillance only covered that cell. But in just a few minutes, the places he could run were limited. For example, the probability of him being upstairs was clearly higher than downstairs. Bang, bang. Door after door was roughly pushed open. As this was a hideout, there wasn't much furniture to hide behind, so opening the doors usually revealed the interior. As for why human traffickers would use a small villa, are you kidding? If they dared to do this business in apartments, communities, or similar places, they'd be reported by the Chaoyang masses in minutes, wouldn't they? After kicking open several doors without seeing Eamon, Liang's heart began to sink, because ahead was the kitchen. And the kitchen had knives. Although it might sound ridiculous for an armed grown man to be afraid of a 6 or 7-year-old child, Liang had heard Sister Chong constantly recount stories of colleagues who had failed since he started in the business. Coupled with Amon's fluid movements when unlocking the door earlier, it made him extremely wary of this kid. Crash. As the glass sliding door was opened, the not-so-large kitchen appeared in Liang's vision. There were no footprints, no signs of climbing, and no extra food items around the refrigerator. Liang held the wooden stick in front of him, vigilantly observing everything in his sight, but still found nothing. Sister Chong, he's not upstairs, do you have? Liang, who had searched upstairs in a circle and failed to find the target, breathed a sigh of relief. He came downstairs with the baseball bat, but just as he was calling out to Sister Chong, he suddenly realized that Auntie Hong should be outside the door at this moment. As the thought arose, he was about to rush towards Auntie Hong, who was sitting on the sofa, but before he could take 2 steps, a sharp pain shot through his lower back. Immediately after, his entire body became disobedient. Several days later, a team of police appeared in this rather desolate outer ring of the city. Captain, it's been 3 days, the people have long gone. The fully armed police surrounded the villa. The one who received the order to knock on the door spoke with some helplessness. Even if there's a 1 in 10,000 chance, we have to seize it. What if that child left some clues? The old police officer leading the team glared at his apprentice. The rookie nodded helplessly and walked to the door with several teammates. They had successfully cracked a major human trafficking case last night. Based on the confessions of the suspects and the descriptions of the rescued children, they found this villa. However, according to their past experience, this time it was probably no, this smell. Team 2, break down the door directly. The originally casual expression of the police suddenly changed drastically. The other members didn't hesitate at all and immediately began to break down the door. In just a few seconds, the seemingly sturdy front door was directly broken open, but what appeared before everyone's eyes was a scene like a scroll from hell. Ah! The police who rushed in first let out a dry retch, but still suppressed the churning in his stomach. He pulled out his pistol, which he hadn't expected to use, and went up. He then reported the situation to his colleagues outside via walkie-talkie. Team leader, I found 2 bodies, in a very gruesome state. A child. No child. It should be those 2 traffickers. Call the forensic doctor over. I can't take it anymore. Listening to his apprentice's words, the old police officer's expression was slightly odd. They had seen gruesome murder scenes before. For his apprentice to be unable to bear it, it couldn't help but make him start imagining. Call the forensic doctor over. Team 3, cordon off the area. Team 2, come with me. The time of death was likely yesterday, and the cause of death was dehydration. From the condition of their bodies, the killer's methods were extremely professional. He precisely damaged the central nervous systems of the two victims, rendering them quadriplegic. Then, he made them watch themselves become incontinent, dehydrate, and slowly die. As for their tongues, they were likely cut off afterward, and the process was very crude. However, I believe this was intentionally done by the killer to inflict the maximum possible suffering. In the extremely odorous room, the forensic doctor described the killer's modus operandi. The perpetrator seemed to have no intention of concealing anything, the entire process appeared remarkably clear. As she spoke, her expression suddenly showed a hint of awe, and she said in a somewhat exaggerated tone, "This is an extremely difficult technique. Even under anesthesia, a skilled surgeon would need a certain amount of time to achieve such precision. Yet, there was only one wound on each person. This killer must possess extremely professional medical knowledge. Even with high natural talent, it would require at least hundreds of neurosurgical clinical experiences to make such a precise cut. We can use this to screen for the killer." "No, there's no need for that." The young police officer shook his head, his tone quite complex. He exchanged a look with his master, finding that the latter's eyes were also filled with disbelief. Quote? The forensic doctor's face showed surprise, thinking, has the killer already been caught? But then, she heard an answer that she found incredibly unbelievable. "The killer should be a 6 or 7-year-old boy. That's impossible. You have to trust my professional expertise. This is absolutely not something a child could do. I'm not talking about the level of cruelty, I'm referring to the technical skill involved. If I may say something I shouldn't, even I would need to anesthetize the person first to achieve this." The forensic doctor felt her professionalism was insulted, but the old police officer shook his head and said, "But all evidence indicates that the killer is that child with a birthmark on his right eye. Whether it's the height of the wounds on their backs or the torment the two traffickers endured, it all matches that child. Furthermore, we just received intelligence from the neighboring city that a major murder case there last month might also be related to this child. The victims then were two marauders. According to the case reconstruction, they likely caught this child, Eamon, after he escaped the orphanage, intending to train him to be a marauder. His lock-picking skills were probably learned then." Walking out of the filth-filled living room with his master, the young police officer said with a peculiar expression, "If I'm not mistaken, only a few days passed between this child escaping the orphanage and the deaths of the two marauders. In such a short time, could he really learn lock-picking to the extent shown in the video? I also think it's impossible." The old police officer sighed, recalling the surveillance video found in the villa. The child's action of almost instantly opening the door lock made him somewhat disbelieving, but sometimes, one has to believe that geniuses exist in this world. Listening to his master's reply, the young police officer's expression grew even more solemn. No matter how much of a genius he is, could a child really devise a method like crippling someone's mobility, cutting out their tongue, and then making them watch themselves slowly die? No, perhaps it's precisely because he is a child that he could do it. The old police officer sighed with a weathered expression. According to the news from the neighboring city, the faces of the marauders who died there were all smashed. Connecting this with the experiences of these two victims and the children in the video, this child might simply be, naively, wanting to return the pain he suffered, tenfold, to these people. Listening to his master's words, the young police officer seemed to understand the child's thoughts and nodded, saying, "In that case, this child probably has an extremely strong desire for revenge. If we don't find him soon, I'm worried more people will be harmed. Actually, this child is the victim. From what he did to the deceased, we can basically infer what he endured. However, you're right, children who lack a sense of good and evil can easily disregard life, easily kill frogs and birds, let alone with his excellent learning ability. We must find him and guide him onto the right path." Listening to his master's powerful words, the young police officer nodded, then turned to glance at the small villa behind him, which still seemed to emit a foul odor, feeling a chill in his heart. After all is said and done, could a child really do such a thing? At this moment, Eamon, only 7 years old, had just woken up from a soft bed, put on a newly bought winter coat, and walked into the bathroom to wash up. After dealing with the two human traffickers, he followed the street to an old residential area and, relying on a marauder's intuition, pried open an unoccupied house and boldly moved in. It must be said that the widespread adoption of those things called smartphones greatly affected the efficiency of marauding, which kept the cash Eamon carried from ever exceeding 200. However, by relying on the skills he had secretly learned from the previous two marauders and finding a shop willing to receive stolen goods, Eamon finally managed to get some money to buy new clothes and food. The furniture and bedding in this house are still very clean. Either they haven't returned from the Spring Festival travel rush, or they left temporarily for something important. I can't stay too long, Eamon thought to himself as he tidied himself in front of the mirror. He also had a smartphone in his hand, a cracked elderly phone he had bought for over 800 from the fence. Although he couldn't link a bank card because he didn't have an ID, he could still make and receive payments using the small withdrawal function of a software wallet. The internet is a good thing, but there's just too much false information and useless news. One needs to carefully discern it. Also, that thing called a Ponzi scheme is very interesting. With a swindler's eloquence, it shouldn't be hard to get money. Casually browsing the encyclopedia, Eamon lamented the variety of swindler methods in this world, but then felt a bit helpless. After all is said and done, his 7-year-old body was too much of a hindrance. If he were older, even 14, he wouldn't be looked at twice by the store clerk just for buying breakfast. In any case, I should register for some social software. These things don't require showing one's face, and it's easy to fake a persona. After getting some travel money, I'll go to some more chaotic countries. Turning off his phone, Eamon left the room, intending to find an unoccupied house with a computer. This wasn't difficult. After all, in this world, people go to work during the day, and he only needed to borrow a computer during the day. In an empty house, Amon's gaze drifted from a joke about a middle school student copying an ID number from a wanted poster for real name registration, only to be surrounded by a group of police officers. He unconsciously wiped a cold sweat. Actually, when he first learned that mobile payments required an ID, he almost copied a document from a roadside utility pole. That was close. Although it seemed like just a joke, Eamon deeply realized the dangers of the internet in this world. As for why Eamon, who was supposed to be researching, suddenly started looking at jokes, it was because the topics he was searching for seemed to be too common knowledge in this world, often leading to push notifications from meme creators. It was probably like searching online for how humans eat, and then big data would push funny videos of people eating noodles through their nostrils. However, this did not bother Eamon much. In fact, from some of the jokes, he understood many of the common sense things about this country. For example, he was now very glad that when he decided to use the internet to understand this world, he chose to break into a house to borrow a computer instead of going to an internet cafe. Actually, he had initially used his old, smart feature phone, which he didn't know how many owners it had, to look up information. But on the first day, he discovered that if he kept using his phone to browse for information, the battery would only last half a day at most, and he had no place to charge it. To charge it, he broke into an empty house. While charging, he discovered that the house had a computer. After that, breaking into empty houses daily to charge his phone and borrow someone's computer became his routine. Although browsing information online was a huge time killer, Amon's good biological clock still reminded him to wake up from the ocean of knowledge before danger approached. He glanced at the clock in the lower right corner of the screen. After confirming that the time was not far from his estimate, he quickly shut down the computer and cleared the traces he had left. Although he was quick and efficient, finding a suitable target was actually very difficult. The main reason was that even slightly upscale apartments now had electronic anti-theft doors that were not susceptible to a marauder's abilities. He even found it difficult to enter the apartment building through the main entrance. In lower-end communities, most families didn't even have computers. In fact, many decent apartments didn't have computers. Eamon thought this probably had nothing to do with economic status, it was more likely that the residents had no occasion to use a computer. After all, they had smartphones. Once the computer's power was completely off, Eamon carefully checked if he had left any obvious footprints, then unplugged his charging phone and left the residence. Stepping out of the house, Eamon glanced at his phone's lock screen. It was a huge world map, which he had specially set up to constantly consider his path. The Middle East, Southeast Asia, South America. These were the three destinations Eamon chose, because he found that these three regions were very similar to the southern continent of his original world. However, considering that this world was likely the so-called old era, this similarity should be stated in reverse. The reason for choosing such places was the sense of familiarity. Of course, more importantly, Europe and America, which were closer to the northern continent, should be harder to survive in than here. It was still the same sentiment. If he were 14 or 15 years old now, he could be sure he would live well in that society filled with commercialized order. But with the body of a 7-year-old child, he didn't think he could live normally in an environment similar to the northern continent. But the southern continent was different again. Ignorance, poverty, war, these disorderly environments were precisely the soil suitable for his survival. However, to go to these places, Eamon had to consider two problems. First, the transportation issue. Not to mention distant places, even for the closest Southeast Asia, he would have to cross a long distance and also consider crossing national borders. As for formal procedures, it was impossible for a child like him, who didn't even have a guardian. Second, the physical issue. As he said, these target areas were full of war and famine. While poverty and ignorance were a hotbed where he could thrive, he also had to consider that his body could get sick and needed to eat. If I could control an adult as a spokesperson, everything would be much easier. It's just a pity I don't have supernatural abilities. Eamon sighed. Even with all his ideas, it was difficult to truly implement them with this body. Of course, he actually had another path, which was self-disguise, to create an persona for himself, such as a runaway billionaire's offspring, and then use this persona to fool a few idiots and then achieve his goals through them. But then, he would have to consider the degree of stupidity and malice. If it were a smart person, they would verify his identity from all angles, and in this world with the internet, his empty words and fraud would be difficult to make flawless. If it were a good person, then the other party would most likely directly send him to the police station, letting the police send this runaway youth back home. But conversely, if the target was not a good person, would they use him as a hostage to demand a ransom? If the target was too stupid, would using them cause more trouble? While considering these things, Eamon walked towards a nearby elementary school. Only near a school would it not seem out of place for a child to buy his own dinner. However, at this moment, Eamon's eyebrows suddenly rose. He did not rashly quicken his pace but maintained a normal stride. Only a few seconds later, his figure had already disappeared from the street. Damn it! The tracker, realizing the target was lost, was slightly stunned, then immediately pressed his ear and said, "The target has a very strong anti-reconnaissance awareness. Is this really a 6 or 7-year-old child? I told you to be careful. He's a genius who mastered lock-picking in just a few days and easily killed an adult much stronger than him. Don't treat him like an ordinary child." A helpless voice came through the communication, but the other party did not sound urgent. The tracker sighed upon hearing this and nodded. "Never mind that for now. Where did he go? The GPS shows he's in a store to your left, but wait a moment. That child doesn't have any sense of proportion. I'm worried. You don't think he'll be killed by him, do you?" The tracker's tone was a bit strange, but the other end of the communicator retorted. "That's not it, but this is near a school after all. It wouldn't be good if other children got hurt. If that's the case, then act quickly before school is out." The tracker sighed, leaned against a tree, looking no different from the parents waiting for their children to get out of school. "He's just a child after all. That's why we can't let him go. Why am I being tracked? Is it those guys who took the children before?" Eamon hid inside a stationery store at the elementary school gate, pretending to be engrossed in choosing gaudy merchandise among a group of children, while pondering who was following him. Considering his distinct birthmark and the number of children around, he didn't think he was unlucky enough to run into human traffickers. The two marauders clearly weren't organized, and that orphanage didn't seem to have much money, so they shouldn't be looking for him across regions. If that's the case, then there's only one possibility left. The trading partners of those masked human traffickers. They likely belonged to some gang, found their subordinate dead and him gone, so they pinpointed him. Did they want to extract information from him? Or are they simply worried he might expose them? Eamon's brain worked rapidly, and he quickly devised a strategy. Since the other party wasn't legitimate, they would surely fear the police. All he had to do was go near the police station. As for whether there were bad people among the police, even if there were, it's unlikely the entire police station would be bribed, right? If that were truly the case, then the other party wouldn't need to follow him at all. Eamon had indeed thought things through carefully, but he never considered that the police were looking for him. This was perhaps a habitual way of thinking, as the sheriffs in Eamon's original world, who had just changed their name to police, were truly a bunch of guys who only knew how to bully the weak and fear the strong. They would rather investigate whether a detective carried a gun than bother with a violently deceased body, let alone one with a typical, gang background, Eamon's opinion. In his original world, if it was confirmed not to involve Beyonder abilities, these cases would be avoided by the police from a distance, not because the police couldn't handle it but because the effort and reward were disproportionate. Of course, his plan to seek refuge near the police station wasn't contradictory, because even the police stations in Eamon's world had a certain deterrent effect. Having thought all this through, Eamon pulled out his phone, bought a utility knife, and then, using the cover of several older students walking home from school, quickly left the street. However, naturally, he was still under police surveillance. Strange, why is this kid heading towards the police station? He wouldn't be coming to surrender, would he? The surveillance officer, having learned from previous lessons, meticulously trailed Eamon with the seriousness of tracking an interprovincial fugitive. As the route ahead became increasingly familiar, he couldn't help but show a surprised expression. It shouldn't be a coincidence. This child's actions have been very purposeful lately. I think he might have mistaken you for a human trafficker or something similar and intends to intimidate you by approaching the police station. The old police officer's voice came through the earpiece. The young police officer asked in surprise. Would someone generally think that way? If the first time you went out, you were abducted by a marauder, and after escaping, you immediately encountered human traffickers, I think you would definitely think that way. The old police officer's tone carried a hint of guilt, then he ordered across all channels, prepare to close the net. Quote. The police station in this world is really simple. Eamon looked at the narrow entrance not far away. Besides a local police badge and sign hanging at the door, it was completely indistinguishable from the surrounding buildings, in fact, it was even a bit shorter. However, he didn't dwell on this too much, as he could still feel that vague sense of being watched. Little friend, why are you here alone? Can't find your way home? Just as Eamon was squatting in a corner, waiting for darkness to fall to find an uninhabited house for the night, a voice came from not far away. Eamon had already noticed this person, or rather, ever since he was knocked out from behind, Eamon had raised his guard to the highest level. This meant he would absolutely not make the error of treating ordinary people as negligible insects again. However, this person was wearing a typical uniform, and judging by the police badge on him, he should indeed be a police officer. Eamon didn't suspect it was a fake. Generally, no one would impersonate a police officer at the entrance of a police station. Meeting a police officer at the police station entrance was a highly probable event, and Eamon had naturally prepared his lines. He looked up and, using the so-called cute child's voice, he learned from the internet, said in a childlike tone. Police uncle, I'm just tired from walking and want to. Before Eamon could finish his sentence, the police officer suddenly took a step forward. At this, Eamon was completely startled. What's going on? Is the darkness here so profound that even the police station has been bought off? Or am I so unlucky that I just ran into a fake police officer? Eamon had already adjusted his body posture the instant the other party's movement became abnormal. His two short legs suddenly burst into action, but no matter how much a 6-year-old's physical fitness was trained, it couldn't be stronger than a trained adult. Almost as soon as he darted out, a large pair of hands grabbed his shoulders. The moment Eamon was restrained, he understood that the other party was very professional. In this position, he couldn't perform any attacking movements with his hands. However, the marauder's agility came into play at this moment. His shoulder joint instantly loosened, and his body twisted in an incredible way. Although it was also due to the police not using heavy force on a child, he did manage to partially break free from the hold, and his heel, not without force, kicked towards the police officer's jaw. But again, his body was ultimately that of a 6 or 7-year-old child. This meant that as long as the other party extended his arm, or even didn't extend it fully, Amon's short legs would find it difficult to reach vital areas. Brushed on the chest by a child's kick, the police officer didn't feel too uncomfortable. After all, in the dead of winter, even without a bulletproof vest, the thickness of the uniform and undershirt alone was enough to cushion such an attack. And in just this brief exchange, a group of police officers had already appeared, holding small handcuffs padded with rubber rings, and restrained Eamon. This kid is really something. Are you sure he never learned martial arts before? Without a certain amount of training, even if he knows how to do it, he couldn't dislocate his joints so easily, could he? The police officer who subdued Eamon patted the small footprint on his chest and asked with a very serious expression, because he now highly suspected whether this kid had received some special assassin training. Although it sounded like a delusion from reading too many novels, besides that, no other hypothesis could explain the abilities this child possessed, not even genius. I've already applied to investigate the orphanage he came from, but at least for now, there are no problems. The other children in that orphanage are also very ordinary. The old police officer habitually put a cigarette in his mouth, but after looking at Eamon, he took it out again, shaking his head and saying, "We also need to investigate this child's background before he was sent to the orphanage, because I'm a bit suspicious now whether there really are organizations in this world that train child assassins." Although the culprit of the serial passionate murder case was successfully apprehended, the police fell into a state of bewilderment. Firstly, Eamon himself only killed villains who objectively posed a great threat to his personal safety. Even if there was an act of torture, for a child, it could still be defined as legitimate self-defense, because a child objectively does not possess the ability to judge whether the target still poses a threat. Moreover, even if the issue of legitimate self-defense is excluded, he is only 7 years old, and no law, regardless of which, could possibly convict a 7-year-old child. Let alone conviction, even a juvenile detention center would not accept a 7-year-old child cold knowledge. Only those aged 14 and above can enter a juvenile detention center. But conversely, they also couldn't send this child back to the orphanage, because the skills he possessed were simply too dangerous. The skill of lock-picking was secondary. After all, in any small town, you could find hundreds of people who could instantly open ordinary locks. What truly concerned them was his exquisite killing skills. This made it difficult for everyone to believe that these were skills an ordinary orphan could master within a few days. In contrast, they were more willing to make rather novel-like conjectures. Some guessed he was a killer cultivated by a killer organization who accidentally got lost. Some guessed he was a child that a killer, when being hunted, had no choice but to send to the orphanage. And as various conjectures gradually increased, there even appeared the outrageous guess that he was a king of killers who had shrunk after drinking some unknown potion. Of course, these were just jokes among the police, but no matter what, such a child absolutely could not be casually released into the wild. "I'll adopt him," the old police officer, nearly 50 years old, said after a series of discussions. "Master, this kid is too dangerous." The young police immediately objected, but the old police officer shook his head and said, "He just lacks a sense of good and evil. As long as he is properly guided, I think there shouldn't be a problem. You see, he hasn't harmed ordinary people, has he?" Looking at the old police officer in front of him, Amon's mouth twitched slightly. After a moment, he asked, as if somewhat incredulous, "You adopted me?" You could say that." The old police officer casually scratched his head, speaking somewhat nonchalantly. "But if you don't want to, you don't have to call me Dad. Uncle or whatever is fine too." "Name?" Eamon, though somewhat surprised that the police would adopt him, still asked. "My name is Li Anbong." Li, as in the surname Li, and Anbong, as in governing the country and ensuring peace. "What about you?" The old police officer knew that Eamon could use smartphones and computers, so he wasn't worried that he was illiterate. Eamon thought for a moment after hearing this, then said, "Eamon. Eamon, is your surname A?" Although old Li had seen the orphanage's records beforehand, he still chose to ask this, partly to inquire whether the child remembered anything from before coming to the orphanage, and partly to build a good relationship with him. Hearing the old police officer's question, Eamon was a bit speechless. He thought for a moment, then shook his head and said, "Eamon is my name. As for my surname, I don't know." Yes, it was only at this moment that Eamon suddenly realized he didn't seem to know his father's surname. Of course, he hadn't cared about this issue before, because in the era he was born, only mortals needed surnames. After all, for deities, if they bestowed a part of their name upon their descendants, then the descendants would inevitably be influenced by their elders because of that part of the name. Therefore, the concept of a surname didn't exist. But after coming to this world, he suddenly realized that his father should have a surname belonging to this world, just like the current the Fool and the Black Emperor. After all, he had already investigated Chernobyl and other things as soon as he got a second-hand smartphone. "Don't know your surname." The old police officer keenly caught the child's strange emotions. Although he knew he should first establish a good relationship at this time, he was still very concerned about the potential killer organization behind this child. After briefly organizing his words, he asked, "Do you remember anything from before coming to the orphanage? Like, do you have any other family? A father and an older brother?" Eamon didn't try to hide it. Although he didn't mind lying, a certain special emotion compelled him to tell the truth. Needless to say, this was another boring emotion brought by this body. The old police officer immediately became vigilant, but he didn't inquire further right away. Instead, he led Eamon out of the police station. Although adopting such a child required quite complex procedures, having been a criminal police officer for decades, he had some ways in this regard, not to mention that this itself could be considered part of handling a case. "Let's go. You've had a tough few days, haven't you? Is there anything you want to eat?" Although Eamon was very displeased with being led around, he didn't try to resist. On one hand, the physical disparity between them was simply too great. On the other hand, he didn't dare to treat this police officer the way he treated human traffickers. As the saying goes, ignorance is bliss. Eamon now had a general understanding of the country's laws. Although he had only casually looked at some key points, he understood that killing human traffickers and harming a police officer were completely different concepts. Seeing Eamon lost in thought, the old police officer didn't speak. He pondered the child's thoughts at the moment, then simply took him home. You sit for a bit. I'll go make something to eat. Your phone was stolen goods and has been confiscated. If you're bored, you can watch TV for now. Leon Bong turned on the TV, tuned it to an animation channel that a child might like, then turned and walked towards the kitchen. Eamon, hearing this, obediently sat on the sofa, watched the childish animation on TV, and with a twitch of his mouth, began to change channels. While cooking, Leon Bong silently observed Amon's actions. Watching him switch the TV to the news channel, he frowned slightly, then sighed softly. This child is precocious, almost terrifying. He really doesn't know who his so-called father is. Leon Bong had considerable doubts about the father Eamon mentioned. He took out his phone, uploaded the information about Eamon having an older brother and a father to the police station's public cloud drive, then continued to cook. As a single old man, his cooking skills weren't outstanding. He casually made a few sweet dishes that children would probably like, then carried the dishes to the dining room. Humans are most likely to reveal information in two states, one is fatigue and the other is relaxation. The former is the interrogation method often seen on TV, where a suspect is shown with a light and not allowed to sleep. The latter is best during meals. Dinner's ready. Hearing Leon Bong's call, Eamon rubbed his stomach, deciding to see what trick this police officer had up his sleeve for now. Eating food that was surprisingly good, pleasant hormones secreted from Amon's tender body. He narrowed his eyes slightly, enjoying the most proper meal he had eaten since coming to this world. Then, he heard Leon Bong's seemingly casual words. Do you remember the names of your family members? Maybe I can help you look for them. You definitely won't find them. Eamon shook his head indifferently. He didn't know his father's exact name, nor could he tell Leon Bong that his father was the creator or the sun god. After some thought, he replied, my brother is Adam. Adam, are you sure? Even if Leon Bong wasn't a mythologist, the name Adam was too well known. Normal people wouldn't give their children such a name, and Eamon clearly had Asian features. Compared to a name, he felt it was more like a codename. Thinking of this, Leon Bong couldn't help but frown, as he considered a possibility. He pulled out his phone and searched for the name Eamon. Then, his eyebrows subtly rose. There were many people with this name, such as Lu Meng, Eamon of Wuxia, from the Zonghua family, and a character from a recent popular novel. However, what caught his attention were two others. One of the 72 demon gods of Solomon, and the chief god of Thebes in ancient Egypt. Is it really related to mythology? Leon Bong ignored the web novel character. After all, it was common for modern creations to borrow mythological names, and the 72 demon gods of Solomon were a particularly common source. However, if it was a codename for a demon god, a series should be used, and Adam was clearly not in the demon god sequence. This meant it was simply using mythology as a codename. You don't think you can find my family using the internet, do you? Eamon looked at Leon Bong's actions and couldn't help but find it amusing. Although he couldn't see Leon Bong's phone, he knew from the movements of his fingers that he was typing, Adam, and, Eamon. Although Eamon had never searched for these things on the internet, he was certain that Adam could not be found in this world. After all, that fellow's authority was, whatever is spoken, shall be known. What he didn't expect was that Leon Bong actually nodded seriously and then said earnestly. That's right. After all, a name that clearly looks like a codename is indeed difficult to trace. What codename? This is a name. Eamon was displeased that a name he had used for thousands of years was being treated as a codename. Although he was a mythological creature who didn't care about such things, the child's body still harbored feelings of dissatisfaction. What normal person would name their child after a mythological figure? Leon Bong saw Amon's expression and his heart stirred. He immediately provoked him, saying. Although Eamon saw the suspicion of being probed, he was also curious about the so-called mythological figure statement. At the same time, a strange thought arose in his mind. Could this not be the past, but the future? So, he followed the doubt in his heart and raised an eyebrow, saying. Mythological figure. Yes, Adam was the first human created by God Almighty in the Bible, and Eamon was the sun god of ancient Egypt. Amon's mouth twitched slightly. Adam was his father's eldest son, and he himself was called, the light that opposes the end of days. He thought for a moment and tentatively asked. What about Abraham? Leon Bong heard this question, and his mouth also twitched. He tapped his phone a few times before saying. That name is mentioned in the Bible. It is said to be the common ancestor of the ancient Hebrew and Arab peoples. What about Jacob? Eamon felt his worldview collapsing and asked in an extremely nervous tone. This time, Leon Bong didn't even need to check and answered directly. Abraham's grandson, who is said to have wrestled with God and injured the tendons in his leg, and is the ancestor of the Israelites. So, are these two also your brothers? Eamon looked utterly bewildered, his eyes unfocused. He didn't answer Leon Bong but continued. What about Medici? Is he also a mythological figure? No, Medici should be a family from the Renaissance period, but I'm not very clear on the specifics. If you want to know, you can look it up yourself, I'll get you a phone later. Leon Bong thought the person who came up with these codenames must be seriously ill. After all, wouldn't using such codenames make people think they were idiots? However, he immediately felt a sense of incongruity. After all, this, Medici, did not belong to this mythological naming system. He suspected it might be a real name, so he said. Is that Medici someone you know? The fool who taught me how to deceive people, Eamon blurted out amidst his wavering thoughts. Leon Bong, however, immediately became alert. He had reason to suspect that this Medici might be the one in the organization responsible for teaching criminal techniques. The two at the dinner table fell silent for a moment. They were thinking about unrelated problems, but they didn't stop eating. A moment later, Eamon finally looked up again and said to Leon Bong. You just said that most of those names are related to the Bible. Do you have a Bible here? How could I? I'm a police officer. Leon Bong rolled his eyes. He was a staunch materialist. Even if he had beliefs, they were in the country and the people. How could he collect such things? However, after thinking for a moment, he still pointed to his phone and said. Although I don't have one at home, there are plenty online. It shouldn't be hard to find if you search. If you want a physical copy, I can buy you one later, it's not hard to buy. Hearing that it wasn't hard to find, Eamon nodded, but still couldn't resist his curiosity and asked, so what exactly is this Bible? It sounds a bit like a religious scripture or something similar. It's not, like, it is a religious scripture. It's the core scripture of Christianity, one of the largest religious denominations in the world. Leon Bong was somewhat surprised by Amon's strange knowledge base. The child was unexpectedly learned in some areas but very naive in matters of common sense. He could only attribute this to a distorted upbringing. Thinking of this, Leon Bong felt that perhaps he shouldn't be so eager to extract information. However, just as he intended to stop probing, Eamon caught a key point and immediately said. You said Christianity. The official term isn't that, but because this denomination has many branches, what with Christianity, Eastern Orthodoxy, Puritanism, Presbyterianism, anyway, people who aren't specifically knowledgeable about it can't understand it, so those too lazy to distinguish simply refer to it as Christianity. Leon Bong explained that his term might be problematic, but Eamon shook his head and said. That doesn't matter. What I want to ask is the holy emblem of this religion a cross? I don't know what a holy emblem is exactly, but the cross is indeed the symbol of Christianity. Why do you have that expression? Seeing Amon's expression change several times in such a short period, Leon Bong, as an old police officer, naturally wouldn't overlook such an obvious detail. Without a doubt, this child's so-called father, brother, and those acquaintances were all highly suspicious. The Holy Cross emblem, is it a religious organization? Leon Bong secretly grew wary. While this country wasn't as severe as the Far East, the Koreans, or the White Elephants, criminal gangs operating under the guise of religion had always been plentiful. And judging by the attitude Eamon displayed, he clearly had his own understanding of religion, which was very dangerous. However, seeing Eamon looking quite conflicted at the moment, Leon Bong temporarily gave up on pressing further. Instead, while thinking about buying him a Bible later to see his reaction, he changed the subject. Speaking of which, how old are you this year? 6 or 7, I guess, I don't know the exact age. Eamon was a bit annoyed by his old police officer's absurd actions and casually responded in a very mature tone. Although not always obvious, Eamon harbored a deep-seated reverence and longing for his father, but now, the image of his father in his heart seemed to have undergone a slight change. How to put it, Amon's current mood was the same as Bernadette's when she read Rosel's diary. Although Rosel's antics were far wilder than White creators, the problem was that Rosel had always been perceived as a human, so his wildness was somewhat acceptable. However, in Amon's heart, White creator was truly a perfect existence without a single flaw. 6 or 7, that's school age. Leon Bong stroked his chin and mumbled. He wasn't worried about Amon's tuition fees, as the child's unique experiences alone made him eligible for special subsidies from the authorities. The current problem, however, was how to prevent Eamon from harming other children when he went to school. If this couldn't be resolved, letting this child attend school would be irresponsible towards the other children. No need, I've already mastered everything I need to. Eamon shook his head decisively. In truth, he wasn't against school. In fact, if he went to school, he would have more opportunities to escape. But after learning about his old police officer's scripture copying, he developed a natural aversion to schools. After all, where he came from, the schools children attended were mostly church schools, and Eamon didn't want to hear a teacher suddenly mention how Adam did this or that during class. That won't do either. In this country, receiving an education is an obligation. A child your age should be going to school. This isn't just for academic subjects, but also for social interaction. If you always stay cooped up at home, you might not be able to adapt to society in the future. Realizing Amon's maturity beyond his age, Lianbong also adopted a more mature way of communicating. Eamon listened to his words, temporarily suppressing his complicated feelings, and observed the old police officer with his eyes, which bore a birthmark resembling dark circles. He suddenly showed a smile that made Lianbong a little scared. You're comfortable with me going to school? Lianbong fell silent upon hearing this. After a moment, he shook his head and said, I'm not comfortable, so I need to live with you for a while. Hey, Eamon let out a soft sigh and didn't elaborate on the matter. Instead, he asked, do you have a computer at home? No, I only use that thing for work. My phone is enough for daily use. If you want to go online, I'll buy you a smartphone later. At this point, Lianbong suddenly seemed to remember something and tentatively asked, oh, right, you seemed very interested in the Bible earlier. Do you want me to buy you a copy? Amon's expression immediately became complicated, but after a moment of hesitation, he still nodded and said, okay. By the way, besides Christianity, are there other religions? There are quite a few, big and small, but among the relevant scriptures, only the Bible is relatively easy to buy. Of course, the local Tao Te Ching is also available, but that's a Taoist classic, and it's a bit different from Taoism. Lianbong pinched the bridge of his nose. His understanding of religious matters wasn't extensive, but it was enough for Eamon. He nodded and said, then please help me buy some common scriptures, and myths. What are the creation myths like here? There are too many of those, and you'll have a hard time finding a unified answer. You can search for them online then. Lianbong could only give such an answer, but he mentally noted down the keyword, myth. In summary, I believe the target most likely comes from an organization with a Christian framework, but considering they extensively use religious figures' names as code names, it shouldn't be an extremist religious group, but rather a skin-wearing type. In the conference room, Lianbong, who had returned to the police station under the pretext of going out for supplies, was sharing the information he had gathered with his colleagues. Immediately, someone raised a hand and said, there are no clear traces of organized gang crimes in the case files from recent years. Furthermore, why would such an organization allow a child to go missing? Perhaps it wasn't going missing, but a mission requirement. Another police officer speculated, for example, he needed to be adopted, or perhaps to give him a relatively legitimate identity. That doesn't make sense. If it was part of a plan, there's no reason he would be repeatedly abducted by thieves and human traffickers. Even if it was a trial to make him see blood, he absolutely shouldn't have ended up at the police station in the end. The young police officer rebutted, then said with a somewhat strange tone, rather than believing all of this was arranged, I'd rather believe he's the heir of some assassin family who's been lost in the outside world or something. At least logically speaking, it makes, you watch too many novels. Where are there assassin families in real life? The old police officer, who had slapped the young police officer on the back of his head, rolled his eyes, then tidied the documents in front of him and said, in any case, let's handle it according to the usual practice for transnational criminal organizations. Old Lee, you'll have to work a bit harder these days. We'll arrange for a few people to stake out near your home. No problem, I was actually planning to adopt this child anyway. Lianbong nodded, then looked at the clock on the wall and said, I've been out for almost half an hour. How are things on my side? He's still watching TV, and yes, it's the news channel. He has no intention of running away. That child is very smart. He should know we have surveillance in the vicinity. Oh, right, are the phone and books ready? Lianbong stood up, and a young police officer immediately handed over a shopping bag. Everything's ready, and the ingredients for tonight's dinner too. Then I'll head back first. Oh, right, you guys check on the religious groups in Korea and the Far East. There are more of those Christianity-wearing A-skin types over there. In the blink of an eye, Eamon had already been living at Lianbong's house for 2 months. To his surprise, Lianbong hadn't inquired about his father or any other information since the first day. Instead, he acted like a normal parent, going to work and coming home every day, occasionally taking Eamon out on holidays. During this time, with the help of Leon Bong, a local, Eamon finally began to understand this world in the correct way. Unlike his previous one-sided and wishful understanding, Leon Bong provided him with a complete set of kindergarten enlightenment readers. Although Eamon felt these things were too childish, he still diligently read every book. Of course, during this process, he also took the time to read mythological works such as the Bible, Homer's epics, the Divine Comedy, and classic of mountains and seas. And then, there was nothing more. Although Eamon wasn't one of those guys with moral GAPI, he inevitably felt a sense of disillusionment. However, what Eamon didn't know was that every internet search he made, every program he watched on TV, and every pause he took while reading was meticulously recorded. Then, through the analysis of professional psychologists, it was transformed into a psychological profile. Eamon, at home, was unaware that his every move was under scrutiny. The inspiration of a half-marauder was not enough for him to perceive the prying eyes of cameras. He was currently browsing web pages seemingly casually, but in his mind, he was contemplating a new escape plan. Yes, he still wanted to run. Although there was no danger in the police officer's home, and he seemed to be able to live a normal life under the identity of his adopted son, he still had no intention of staying there for long. As for the reason, it was somewhat amusing, because he felt that if he stayed any longer, he would truly become an elementary school student. The influence of the body on the soul was very obvious. Even though his memory told him that he was still the god of deception, the second son of the creator, an emotionless mythological creature, it was precisely this insight that made him even more convinced that his spirit was integrating into this body. At the same time, he also realized that he was no longer detached and independent from this world. For example, the old police officer named Leon Bong gradually occupied a significant position in his heart. This might sound a bit exaggerated, but Eamon was sure that he couldn't lay a hand on him now. He was worried that if he stayed in this home, he would be assimilated by these ants. Is this the goal of the current the fool? Eamon looked at the tourist map of the city on his phone, looking like a child thinking about how to go out with his parents on the weekend, but in his heart, he was constantly cursing the current the fool. Amon's rationality told him that he should kill that old police officer, but on the other hand, he told himself that killing a police officer and killing a human trafficker were two completely different concepts. Of course, Eamon himself was very clear that worrying about punishment was just an excuse, he simply couldn't bring himself to do it. This absolutely cannot continue. Eamon slammed his phone onto the table, glancing out the window a few times. Although he couldn't feel any surveillance, even if he thought with the brain of a microbial clone, he knew he must be monitored, it was just that he couldn't detect the other party's surveillance. Chief, Eamon seems to be preparing to escape. Inside the Serious Crimes Unit office, a young police officer said anxiously. Leon Bong, hearing this, frowned and said, "Do you really think he can find that organization? We're not sure, but based on the micro-expressions he displayed while reading, we roughly infer that he is not completely ignorant of his so-called father's organization. You know, we cannot allow such a dangerous group with unknown origins within our borders, and this child is currently the only clue." The chief of the Serious Crimes Unit spoke earnestly to his old colleague. Leon Bong nodded, helplessly saying, "All right, but to avoid suspicion, I won't participate for now. But what if he doesn't find them? As we said before, we'll just treat it as a suspect escaping. You'll be fined 2 months' salary and ordered to keep a strict watch." The chief of the Serious Crimes Unit said with a smirk. Leon Bong also looked helpless upon hearing this and nodded. If he passes the assessment, then his application to go to school should be approved, right? That's not a problem, but you understand his special nature. Even if the psychological evaluation is fine, we can't reduce our supervision of him. This was a day in early June. Leon Bong woke up early as usual, made breakfast for Eamon, and then picked up his bag, ready to go to work. Before leaving the house, he said as always, "Don't run around at home, don't touch anything in the kitchen, and call me immediately if anything happens. Got it, be careful on your way." Eamon looked at Leon Bong with a somewhat complex gaze, then nodded. Then he heard the other party suddenly turn around as if remembering something and said, "Oh, about your schooling, I've already taken care of it. You can go to school this September." "You know I don't really want to go to school." Amon's mouth twitched. The hesitation he had felt instantly solidified. As the door lock clicked softly, Eamon slowly slipped into his room, playing with the assembly toy he had bought a few days ago. Of course, such childish behavior was clearly not Amon's true purpose. During the time Leon Bong left for work every day, he had already used the pretense of playing to check every nook and cranny of the room, and indeed found no cameras, leading him to conclude that the surveillance must be coming from outside the window. However, this couldn't be blamed on Eamon. After all, his phone had been specially processed, embedded with a special mode even more harmonious than a children's mode, capable of filtering out much information that was inconvenient for him to know, such as pinhole cameras built into appliances or illegal software that secretly used phone cameras for recording. Under the surveillance of several cameras, Eamon innocently adjusted his sitting posture, blocking the direction of the window with his body, and then pulled out a small contraption assembled from strange parts. Well, although the style was a bit odd, Eamon had limited access to parts. Even if he upheld the traditional art of, it's a child's nature to take things apart, he could at most dismantle televisions, watches, and radios. In fact, relying solely on these few things and the electrical knowledge learned online, the police were also very curious about what surprise this little guy could come up with. Click. Eamon plugged the strange device in his hand into the wall socket. Almost instantly, all the cameras turned to static. What kind of genius is this kid? The complete failure of the surrounding surveillance systems truly shocked the police officers in the Serious Crimes Unit office, and the chief of the Serious Crimes Unit immediately looked at the technical department officer. Xiao Lu, what's going on? Didn't you say he made a transmitter? Xiao Lu's face darkened at the question, and he immediately explained, I didn't get my hands on it directly, but from the components and structure, it should indeed be a transmitting device. Then explain why a transmitting device can disable surveillance. Did he make a remote control? Did he hijack cameras that don't even have receiving capabilities? Even if I don't understand technology, I know that's impossible. The chief of the Serious Crimes Unit shouted, but Xiao Lu's expression grew even more helpless. It's not a hijack, this should be signal interference, although I don't know how he managed to create such a perfectly timed frequency. The device's power comes from just a small battery, so its power won't be too great, and its range and duration won't be too long. Monitoring with high-altitude drones is still feasible. At this point, Xiao Lu seemed to suddenly remember something and spoke in a very solemn tone. Oh, and if possible, try to ensure the integrity of that device. Its value is frighteningly high. Whether for our own use or to guard against others using it, we must obtain a sample. Is it that serious? The chief of the Serious Crimes Unit realized the gravity of the situation upon hearing this and immediately said, I'll go inform the higher-ups. You all continue to monitor. If necessary, you can abandon the bait plan and proceed directly with the arrest. Understood. After activating the signal jamming device, Eamon immediately began to flee along the pre-planned route. In the past few months, he had firmly memorized the surrounding terrain. How does that saying go? He looks like a child on the outside, but his wisdom surpasses that of ordinary people. This is Amon's true portrayal at this moment. Although his body is still that of a 7-year-old child, his soul contains the thousands of years of achievements of a top marauder. How many people had Eamon stolen from? How many Beyonders were among them? Eamon himself probably couldn't even remember. Even though his Beyonder abilities had been stripped away, the stolen knowledge and memories were all accumulated within his soul. Previously, he had no intention of studying these things, because for Eamon, having the marauder's abilities was enough. However, now, Eamon was incredibly grateful for the potion's strengthening of his soul. This allowed him, even in his current desperate situation, to still unearth knowledge belonging to other pathways from his memories. And among them, the most useful were naturally those from the Savant pathway. Even without Beyonder knowledge as assistance, relying on the advanced, technological, creations of this world, the knowledge from the Savant pathway could still provide a considerable advantage. After weaving through streets and alleys several times, Eamon still didn't sense the presence of any observers, and he immediately breathed a sigh of relief. For a moment, it seemed that the past few months of learning had also proven valuable. Ha 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 ha, I'm finally out. Eamon let out an uncontrollable burst of laughter, but he quickly suppressed the emotional outburst because he had now deeply realized the capabilities of this country's police. If they wanted to find him, merely running this short distance would definitely not be enough. After the surveillance goes offline, the police should immediately start taking action. I must leave this city as soon as possible. Eamon muttered to himself, then walked onto the street with his elementary school-style backpack. The ride-sharing car he had called when he went downstairs had also just arrived by the roadside. Little friend, where are your parents? Looking at Eamon with his backpack, the taxi driver showed a strange expression, because the destination displayed on the navigation was a piano training class in the suburbs, which was more than an hour's drive from here. This child looked only 6 or 7 years old. Were his parents really so careless as to let him go so far alone? Eamon heard the driver's words but put on a very practiced demeanor, opening the car door while saying in a childish voice, "It's just me. My class starts at 9 o'clock. Uncle, can you go a little faster?" "Ah, that's quite far." The driver was still a bit hesitant, but Eamon showed an impatient expression and said, "I know, the suburbs, right. It's 7:10 now. Can we get there in an hour and 50 minutes? "Yes, we can." The driver, hearing the child's practiced reply, finally nodded, but he was still somewhat uneasy. After Eamon got in the car, he checked the trip recording, then carefully closed the windows and confirmed the child's seatbelt to ensure he wouldn't be extorted. "The target is in the car. Ha, this kid is really eloquent." The police officer monitoring with the drone mumbled, signaling his partner to start driving. His partner, however, shook his head. "That's not just eloquence. This kid has a very high level of psychological attainment." In just a few sentences, he created an image of someone who frequently takes taxis alone, while also showing just the right amount of dissatisfaction, giving the driver a sense of pressure unbefitting his age, making the driver feel that this child really might give a bad review. "It's just because he's a child. Otherwise, if I encountered someone like this, I would definitely check if he has a record of pyramid schemes or fraud. Tisk, no wonder there's such a big fuss. What kind of monster is this little ghost after all?" Once the car started, the police officer, while looking at the drone monitoring screen in his hand, chatted idly, because the other party seemed to have very keen anti-reconnaissance abilities, so they wouldn't follow too closely. "I don't know. Anyway, it's said that it might be related to criminal organizations or something. Speaking of which, do organizations really cultivate such child assassins in real life?" The driving police officer also read novels, but it was precisely because he read novels that he was even more disbelieving that such things would happen in reality. "Of course they do." The monitoring police officer replied affirmatively. "My old man back then, ahem, anyway, he told me that those fanatical terrorist organizations would start training child soldiers from a very young age, and many of them would be dispatched as assassins. Don't let their young age fool you. Each one of them is capable of carrying a grenade in their pocket and perishing with others." "That's not the same, is it?" The driving police officer shook his head. "The kind you're talking about are suicide bombers. This little ghost is clearly a technical talent. How do you think one would educate a 7-year-old child to be proficient in psychology, rhetoric, lockpicking, anatomy, and other subjects? Or rather, how much effort do you think it would take to cultivate such a child? I'd like to know too. But no matter what, this is definitely a deranged individual. Maybe it's that kind of GU-style education, 100 or so children in a training class, competing with each other, taking a test every month, and the one with the worst score gets killed in front of the others or something." After traversing half the city, the car finally stopped in front of the Isabella piano training class, located in the suburbs. This training class seemed to have been open for quite some time, even its sign looked a bit old. However, there were many children around, and the building itself was clean and tidy. Coupled with its nice European-style decor, it exuded a certain artistic ambiance. "Thank you, Uncle," Eamon said in a childish, adorable voice, transferring a sum that made him wince to the driver. After all, since his escape, he had no pocket money to speak of. While he wasn't averse to stealing, that would only happen after he left this city. However, considering that further outside the city, there would likely be a desolate area where he couldn't spend money even if he wanted to, Eamon felt much better. The driver, on the other hand, didn't think much of it. After confirming the payment, he accepted a nearby order and prepared to leave. Initially, he had considered whether to follow the child to keep an eye on him, fearing that if the child got lost, he might get into trouble. But seeing so many children here, he felt much more at ease. However, out of caution for the world, he kept his dashcam recording and drove away. Seeing the driver completely disappear from sight, Eamon breathed a sigh of relief. He pinched the corner of his eye, where a dark circle's birthmark was, and quickly vanished among the gradually lower buildings. He certainly wasn't going to any piano training. According to his investigation, there was simply a path to the wilderness nearby. According to the map he found online, about 2 kilometers north from here was a large river. Once across the river, it was essentially a sparsely populated area. 10 kilometers east along the river, he would reach a small town. He could rest there for a night, then continue east. Even with his frail body, he could reach the next city in at most 5 days. Of course, he also understood that it would be easy for the police in neighboring cities to investigate, but there were still many procedures to go through. According to the information he found online, this country emphasized procedural justice, and going through procedures was a very slow process. With this buffer time, he could completely make a few scores in the next city and then take a long-distance bus to the city after that. The plan should have been like this. But Eamon never expected the road to be so difficult. The summer weather was naturally hot. Eamon hadn't even reached the riverside before his mouth was dry. He pulled out the boiled water he had filled before leaving and took a few gulps, then put it back in his backpack. Although he had the urge to discard all his heavy items and travel light, the warnings from numerous wilderness survival videos made him abandon that idea. Although the wilderness and the city are different, for Eamon, the city is also a steel jungle. Every person in this jungle, to him, is an insignificant but potentially deadly insect. And those smartphones are prey that can provide him with several days' worth of protein consumption. Not simple, is it? This counts as a 5-kilometer cross-country trek with a load, right? Most high schoolers couldn't even manage it. The police officer, sitting in the car and remotely tracking him via drone, exclaimed. Forget 5 kilometers, if it were his own kid, it would be good if he didn't demand to be carried after 500 meters. 4.7 kilometers, the driving police officer glanced at the electronic map and stretched. He had been cooped up in the car since early morning and now felt a bit of back pain. If it were a car chase, that would be one thing, but now they were chasing a 7-year-old child who kept stopping and starting. It felt like being stuck on the highway on the first day of a long holiday road trip. Moving 1 kilometer in an hour would be a blessing from God. If you're tired, let's switch. We don't know what we'll encounter next, and maintaining your condition is quite important, the police officer monitoring the screen immediately said upon seeing his partner's state. The driving police officer didn't decline, opened the car door, and climbed into the back seat. He took over the monitoring device from the other officer and lay down in the back seat, starting to stretch. The monitoring police officer then moved to the driver's seat, buckled his seatbelt, and became the driving police officer. The team responsible for tracking and monitoring Eamon was clearly more than just these two. After all, the peculiarities Eamon displayed were simply too numerous, quickly attracting considerable attention after being reported. Especially after the little gadget that could block surveillance appeared, even representatives from the military were sent, ready to call in the main force if there was even a slight problem. However, Eamon clearly didn't know he was in the midst of such a setup. As a mortal, he obviously couldn't see the black dot in the sky. Based on his simple understanding acquired from 2 petty thieves, the further one was from the city, the fewer surveillance cameras there were, and the more open a place was, the lower the probability of being monitored. This was also one of the reasons he specifically went to the wilderness to complete his intercity movement. After walking along the river for half an hour, Amon's short-sleeved shirt was soaked with sweat, and the side of his backpack pressed against his back was already covered in a layer of salt frost. He casually tossed the empty water bottle and checked the navigation on his phone. 7 more kilometers. Eamon discovered with some despair that he had only covered a small portion of the journey. His eyes involuntarily began to blur, and it was now approaching the hottest part of the day. He seriously doubted whether his small body could endure it. Should I go back? Being an elementary school student isn't so bad. A thought popped into Amon's mind, and his hand uncontrollably reached for the button representing communication. But in an instant, he forcefully curbed his weakness, gritting his teeth and abandoning the idea of being an elementary school student. This is what the fool wants me to do. Since he wants me to be like this, then I absolutely cannot let him have his way. Eamon took a deep breath, relying purely on malice and obsession to overcome his weakness. He took off his clothes, rinsed them in the muddy river water, then wrung them out forcefully to make them feel cooler. Although wearing them wet would certainly be cooler, Eamon worried that it would cause his weak body to fall ill. He pulled out a piece of bread from his backpack, ate it in a few bites with some water, and further lightened his load. After about 10 minutes of rest, he used his strong willpower to overcome the urge to take a quick nap, successfully stood up, and with his small backpack, once again embarked on his escape. Old Lee, your little rascal is truly extraordinary. Old Lee, who was dutifully staying at the police station under surveillance to avoid suspicion, heard the chief of the Serious Crimes Unit's words and smiled, then shook his head, saying, "This isn't something I cultivated. The better he performs now, the more I worry. After all, he might not be the only one, and just thinking about an unknown organization in our country raising many such children sends shivers down my spine." "You're right," the chief of the Serious Crimes Unit nodded in agreement, but then smiled and added. "But there's no need to be too pessimistic. I see that this child isn't without affection for you. If he's nurtured well in the future, he might become a pillar of society. If only that were truly possible." At 5 in the afternoon on the day Eamon fled, he looked at the gradually dense buildings in the distance and almost collapsed to the ground. He forced himself to take a breath, pulled out the last bottle of lukewarm water, heated by the ambient temperature, from his backpack, poured it into his mouth, and then continued to walk forward. A dozen kilometers of loaded cross-country travel was undoubtedly a terrifying burden for a child. If Eamon hadn't been exercising regularly during this period and possessed a willpower far exceeding that of a child, he wouldn't have been able to make it. However, although Eamon appeared somewhat disheveled at this moment, he didn't stand out, because in this season, in a village that could already be called rural, little boys his age were generally covered in mud. A somewhat disheveled Eamon found a small shop and bought some snacks and water to replenish salts and calories. Although it wasn't healthy, snacks full of oil, sugar, and salt could replenish energy faster than many other foods. Not to mention, a little mud-covered boy like him wasn't suitable for ordering at a restaurant, and there were no fast food chains like KFC or McDonald's around where a child ordering wouldn't seem out of place. After gnawing on 2 bags of crispy rice and downing a bottle of yogurt, Eamon finally recovered. He slowly continued to walk with heavy steps. After long-term preparation, Eamon already knew that the fragile human body couldn't rest immediately after high-intensity exercise. He needed to slowly cool down his body to avoid aggravating the burden on it. At this moment, Eamon had a deeper understanding of human fragility. If, in his past as the god of deception, he merely felt that humans were insects to be crushed at will, a condescending disdain from a superior perspective, then Eamon, who was now meticulously avoiding harming this body, had developed a hint of sympathy. Of course, this sympathy was not for humanity as a whole, but merely for himself. But no matter what, Eamon had indeed begun to acquire humanity. This humanity was not imposed upon him by the hormones of this child's body but originated from the core of his soul. He seemed to have begun to realize that these ordinary people, like straw, did not live an easy life. As a 7-year-old child, it was difficult for Eamon to even lie about his age to sleep in an internet cafe, let alone a hotel that required identity verification. He could only follow his plan, board a bus, travel to the bustling part of the town, and fence the phones he had stolen along the way. Don't ask how he managed to find a fencing den so quickly. During several attempts to locate such places, he had already cracked the industry's secret codes. Those inconspicuous marks on the shop signs willing to receive stolen goods were no longer hidden from Amon's eyes. However, what Eamon didn't know was that shortly after he left, the shop that received the stolen goods was busted. An plainclothes officer took over his work, and the unlucky shopkeeper was arrested, believing he had been caught fencing, but was bewildered while being interrogated by the security department. He probably wouldn't realize for a while that he seemed to have been mistaken for a peripheral member of some formidable organization. Although he now had money, Eamon only found a Shaxian delicacies restaurant. After eating his fill, he began to search for a suitable bridge underpass to spend the night, following the so-called Sanhei Great God tutorials online. Meanwhile, in the Shaxian delicacies restaurant Eamon had just left, a man approached a waitress and whispered, "A hymn of loyalty. Get lost." The waitress rolled her eyes, ignored the man, and went into the staff room. Soon after, she came out in casual clothes and left work as usual. "How was it? Anything special?" Seeing the waitress emerge, the man immediately went up to her, grinning, and said, "Well, any clues?" "No, I checked the cutlery and tables. Besides the fact that he ate very cleanly, there was nothing that could serve as a mark. Of course, I still took photos for documentation and uploaded them. If you think there's any hidden code, you can go back and decipher it yourselves." The waitress spoke softly. The two then found a street food stall, sat down, and started eating skewers, looking no different from ordinary people enjoying skewers with friends after work. On the other side, Eamon had already found a relatively secluded bridge underpass and pulled out a bedsheet from his backpack, preparing to rest. It must be said that finding a bridge underpass suitable for sleeping, like those seen in online videos, was quite difficult, especially those with heat vents on the ground, which were even rarer. However, Eamon had considered this issue. The reason he waited until summer to initiate his escape plan was precisely to avoid the problem of getting cold while sleeping under a bridge. After all, he wasn't one of those tough individuals who slept under bridges with a small blanket. He didn't have a small blanket. Eamon had originally intended to bring one, but later gave up. It was fortunate he did, otherwise, if he had carried an extra blanket, Eamon felt he might not have made it this far. Noticing the lost line of sight as Eamon entered the bridge underpass, the tracking team immediately reported it. Subsequently, a plainclothes officer disguised as a homeless man, dragging a tattered bundle, arrived under the bridge. Seeing Eamon, wrapped in a bedsheet, watching him warily, he immediately said, "Kid, this is my turf. Eamon scrutinized him from head to toe, assessed the difference in combat strength between himself and the homeless man, and finally softened his tone, saying in a childish voice, "I'll just sleep for one night, I'll leave tomorrow. This is such a big place, I just need a small corner. I can share some food with you." Saying this, he pitifully pulled out a few candies from his backpack, looking like a primary school student who had run away from home. These naughty kids nowadays. The plainclothes officer, fully committed to his act, spread out a blanket, huddled on the ground, and then shook his head, no longer paying attention to him. Eamon couldn't help but breathe a sigh of relief. Although he could feel the homeless man watching him, this was a normal reaction. He simply gripped the small knife hidden in his backpack and began to rest while remaining vigilant. Through the pinhole camera hidden on the homeless man, the police department saw Amon's entire performance. In reality, everyone pretty much knew what was in Amon's bag, and they also knew there was a small knife in it. Generally speaking, such a small knife paired with a child would not pose a threat in the eyes of professionally trained police officers. However, Eamon had the impressive feat of incapacitating two adults with a dining knife. Both the surveillance department and the plainclothes officer lying opposite Eamon felt a degree of tension at this moment. It's just strange, judging by this little guy's appearance, it doesn't look like he has anyone waiting to meet him. Amon's first night away from home passed uneventfully. Although Eamon remained on edge, he didn't actually suffer any attacks. But when the morning light shone into the bridge arch, Eamon only felt a great burden, because now, his whole body was aching. Yesterday's weighted cross-country trek was not without its cost. Even though Eamon had been exercising well recently, and hadn't suffered terrible consequences like rhabdomyolysis, it was still inevitable to wake up with a sore back and aching muscles the next day. Fortunately, Eamon was still young, and this condition usually recovered within 2 or 3 days. However, the current Eamon didn't have 2 or 3 days to rest. He forcefully dragged himself off the cement floor, which was only covered by a single sheet, using sheer willpower. Eamon folded the sheet, stuffed it into his backpack, and resumed his journey. This time, however, his steps were not light, and his short legs trembled uncontrollably with every step he took. "This kid is good stuff." In the conference room, the man sitting in front of the monitor said with shining eyes. But then, thinking that the child's background might be problematic, he shook his head helplessly. "Yes, not to mention a child, even a bunch of new recruits came to my side before, and some couldn't stand it after standing at attention for a few days." The military representative next to him also said with emotion, but his eyes revealed an undeniable seriousness. He found it hard to imagine what kind of rigorous training a 7-year-old child must have undergone to possess such willpower. "Keep watching. The child's appearance itself is very strange, but as long as we follow him, we will definitely get results." The chief of the Serious Crimes Unit sighed and continued to give orders to the tracking team. Eamon, completely oblivious to all of this, had by now unsteadily arrived at the long-distance bus station and began searching for the bus ticket he had planned for. As a child, buying a ticket was obviously very troublesome, but besides being a child, Eamon was also an experienced thief. After wandering around the crowded ticket hall a few times, he successfully obtained a ticket to a nearby county town. According to the information on the ticket, the entire journey would last 17 hours. However, this suited Eamon perfectly. In fact, if he hadn't considered the possibility of being stopped en route due to the long journey, he would have preferred to find an ultra-long-distance bus with sleeper berths. Based on his investigation into this world's crime-solving methods during this period through filtered online information and some crime-themed movies, he found that constantly changing vehicles had a lower probability of being traced than taking one vehicle all the way. Moreover, if there were some transfers on foot along the way, it would be almost impossible to find him again. Eamon felt that as long as he could reach a slow-paced, obscure small town, he should no longer be found. By then, he would naturally have more time to think about his next steps. However, at this point, Eamon only felt a sense of confusion, because he truly didn't know the meaning of his escape. He escaped the orphanage for freedom, and he escaped the thieves and human traffickers for his life. But now, why was he escaping from that old police officer? Perhaps it was just to prove a point. To prove that he, Eamon, wouldn't live according to the path others set for him. Thinking of this, Amon's face suddenly showed a smile that didn't match his outward age. "I, a mythical creature thousands of years old, actually call a human in his 50s an old police officer." Thinking of this, he shook his head, no longer delving deeper, but instead got up and boarded the long-distance bus heading to the small county town. The bus quickly started, but it didn't immediately hit the road. Instead, it kept circling the long-distance bus station. Ayman was very confused by this, even suspecting at one point that he had gotten on an illegal taxi. But when he noticed that new passengers boarded with each round, and the surrounding passengers also started complaining, he finally understood the reason for this phenomenon. Because the bus wasn't full, the driver felt it would be too much of a loss to make a trip. When the bus finally drove out of the station area, Aman's mood also relaxed. He looked at the scenery passing by outside the window, and a faint drowsiness suddenly came over him. Last night, to guard against that homeless man, he hadn't dared to sleep too deeply. Now, the fatigue of the entire day finally became unbearable, and amidst the bumps of the bus, he slowly closed his eyes. He is just a child after all. In front of the monitor, a group of grown men sighed helplessly. Watching a child's difficult journey, they couldn't help but feel a bit of compassion. However, the issues involved with this child were truly serious, and even if they felt reluctant, they could only watch silently. Just then, Ayman in the picture suddenly shivered. The police in front of the monitor immediately turned their attention back to the screen. Seeing Ayman suddenly wake up and cast a wary gaze in one direction, the chief of the Serious Crimes Unit immediately gave the order. Adjust the camera. Yes, because of Aman's demonstrated anti-surveillance abilities, the police who boarded the bus had been ordered not to directly observe Ayman. All surveillance was controlled by several remote cameras on him, and the people operating these cameras were at least 2 kilometers away from Ayman. As the order was given to the surveillance team, the camera slowly rotated along Aman's line of sight. After multiple comparisons, everyone finally confirmed that Ayman was looking at a middle-aged woman holding a child. This was a middle-aged woman with distinct rural features, her cheeks and hands were rough, and she looked unremarkable. But everyone present was an old police officer, and they quickly determined that this woman was secretly observing Ayman. This woman is very likely a human trafficker. Notify the neighboring town to see if they have any cases of missing infants. The chief of the Serious Crimes Unit quickly reacted and immediately issued the order. After several calls were made, no immediate results were obtained. Without much hesitation, the chief of the Serious Crimes Unit said, "Send a text message to Xiao Zhang, follow that woman after getting off the bus. Others will take over Aman's side." Understood. The communicator immediately began to compose the text message. Although Aman's lead was very important, as police, they couldn't turn a blind eye to a crime that might be occurring. At this very moment, Ayman had a completely different idea. He looked at the woman who was secretly observing him, his hand already gripping the small knife in his bag. His killing intent was boiling. The former Ayman rarely had such a thing as killing intent. He mostly killed on a whim, because he wanted to do it, he did it. That was Aman's usual behavior. But human traffickers were not included in this category. Human traffickers must die. This was the first, bottom line, Ayman had acquired since coming to this world. The female human trafficker, completely unaware that she had been targeted by plainclothes officers and the god of deception, was still greedily glancing at Ayman. She wasn't part of an organized human trafficking syndicate, nor did she have a fixed hunting ground. She operated in the low-end market, mainly selling people to rural areas. Just as Sister Chong and A Liang had said before, if you sell them deep in the mountains, who cares if they have birthmarks? Although infants were the easiest to acquire in the human trafficking business and the least likely to be exposed, when it came to ease of selling, children aged 6 or 7 were indeed the most popular. Children older than that would start to remember things, making them difficult to assimilate, while younger ones were completely unable to care for themselves. Seeing that this child seemed to be traveling alone on a long journey, he might even be given the label, able to do labor, which could increase his price. Thinking this, the human trafficker, disguised as a farm woman, found herself increasingly unable to look away. Ayman naturally easily detected the increasingly focused gaze and couldn't help but sneer inwardly, a strong killing intent surging within him. He even began to ponder whether to cripple her mobility and let her watch herself die bit by bit, like the 2 human traffickers before, or to preserve her sense of pain and torture her to death little by little. However, as Ayman was thinking, a faint noise suddenly appeared in his mind. Although it was subtle, Ayman clearly knew it was Li Anbong's voice. Those were the words Li Anbong had said to him shortly after bringing him home. Human traffickers are guilty, but that doesn't mean you have the right to judge them. When facing danger, your self-defense is not wrong, but I hope you don't think that taking another person's life is the right thing to do. So annoying. Ayman scratched his head vigorously. The various methods of abuse he had imagined earlier no longer felt satisfying. Feeling the farm woman's gaze still lingering on him, Aman's anger flared up again, and he began to mumble to himself. The rest stop is coming up soon. Tell Xiao Zhang to keep an eye on the suspect and make sure she doesn't run off midway. Also, be careful not to hurt the child. Inside the monitoring room, the police officer responsible for redirecting surveillance signals immediately began working after receiving the order. However, shortly after the long-distance bus stopped at the rest stop, a tense voice suddenly rang out. "Oh no, what is he going to do?" The police officer, who was in the middle of editing a text message, flinched at the sound. Looking at the screen, he saw that Eamon had already followed the passengers off the bus and purposefully brushed past the woman suspected of being a human trafficker. And for those who had been continuously monitoring them, it was not difficult to confirm that the hand in his pocket was definitely holding a knife. Xiao Zhang, who had now shifted his focus to the farm woman, the suspected human trafficker, suddenly frowned because the farm woman, who was holding a baby, hadn't reacted yet, but the child he was originally monitoring had already walked over. A prompt to prepare came through his silent earpiece, and Xiao Zhang slowly moved his feet. Although he wished all human traffickers would die, he didn't want this child to be stained with another life. However, Amon's movements were much faster than they had imagined. When the farm woman, whose eyes were blinded by greed, followed him to a corner, Eamon moved with extreme speed. Even though Xiao Zhang was already running, it was impossible for him to instantly cover a distance of several meters. But before his despair could fully rise, the farm woman had already fallen to the ground, but it seemed there was no blood. Phew, he attacked the carotid sinus, she should only be knocked out. This child didn't intend to kill. A relieved voice came through the earpiece. Xiao Zhang immediately stopped, pivoted to avoid standing in a direct line with Eamon, and while grabbing a bottle of water from a nearby convenience store, he received updates on Amon's situation through his earpiece. Eamon didn't think that much. He looked down at the woman lying on the ground, gently touched the baby that had been caught as the woman fell, and curled his lip in disgust, yet still mumbled to himself as if in self-hypnosis. Killing people in this country is a serious matter and easily attracts the attention of the authorities. A missing child and a dead person are completely different concepts. I can't get myself caught back just to kill this person. That's right, it has nothing to do with that old guy, I just don't want my plan to fail because of an ant. Eamon continued to mumble like this, dragging the farm woman to a more secluded corner. He pulled out a piece of paper from his backpack, wrote the crooked words, "This is a human trafficker," with a marker, then took off the farm woman's headscarf to tie her up, and skillfully pulled out her phone. "Connect the call." The chief of the Serious Crimes Unit immediately gave the order. The technician beside him was stunned for a moment, then said with a wry smile. "Chief, this kid dialed 110. No one had expected such a result, but the chief still maintained his authority and said, "Isn't that even easier? Connect it quickly." All right, the technician quickly operated, but because it was an emergency call, if he directly cut the line without proper procedures, it might cause panic. So after reporting it, he directly transferred the call content. Thus, a very mature male voice soon echoed in the room. "Hello, is this the police station? I want to report a case. This is XX Rest Stop, yes, the one in Oo County. There's a woman here who just fell and passed out. She also has a child. Yes, an ambulance. I couldn't remember the ambulance number for a moment, anyway, you guys hurry up and come." Me. I'm a kind-hearted passerby. PFF'd, someone couldn't hold back first, and the room burst into laughter. However, after a while of laughter, everyone couldn't help but look at each other, and finally, the old chief of the Serious Crimes Unit was the first to speak. "Notify the local police station to handle it, but Xiao Zhang's few steps just now still carried a risk of exposure, so let's switch people as planned." "Understood, I'll go notify them now." The communicator nodded and quickly operated. The old chief, however, glanced at Leon Bong, who had been staying in the office to avoid suspicion, and said with a smile, "It looks like you've taught this little guy well. I thought he had murderous intentions just now. It's not that you thought, he really did want to kill just now." Hearing this, Leon Bong shook his head helplessly, his tone quite dejected. "I should have talked to him more. It's already good. Actually, our idea of fishing delayed this child's education." The old chief shook his head and comforted him. "From this child's actions this time, you can tell his nature isn't bad. After this is over, teach him well, and he will definitely have a promising future." After reporting the human trafficker with a disguised voice, Eamon, holding his bento box, hid in the shadows. Although he was confident that his disguised voice had no flaws, he cautiously chose to conceal himself to avoid trouble. In fact, he had already investigated the surrounding environment, including using map navigation to confirm the available transportation nearby. If he detected anything unusual, he would immediately forego taking a car and leave on foot. Though he knew it would be an arduous journey just thinking about it, Eamon felt he could endure it for freedom and to prevent that hateful current the fool from succeeding. However, the police, who had intentionally let Eamon out as bait, clearly wouldn't be so ungracious as to arrest him. After the police took away the female human trafficker and the suspected abducted infant, everything returned to normal, as if nothing had happened. Eamon, confirming all the police had left, finally breathed a sigh of relief. He returned to the long-distance train, hugged his backpack, and slowly drifted into sleep, maintaining his grip on the small knife. No, his sleep was not deep at all. He would immediately wake up at the slightest disturbance. But nothing else happened on the journey. More than 10 hours later, he got off at a long-distance bus station in a small county town. The straight-line distance here from the city where Lianbong was located was over 200 kilometers. Here, he could finally relax a bit and start his old profession again, beginning to earn his living expenses for the next few days. However, this time he didn't target ordinary people but aimed at his peers within the station. Whether in Backland, Pritz Harbor, or this world, stations are always places where pickpockets gather, and these guys who form gangs to steal others' property often don't expect anyone to target their own pockets. In just half an hour, Amon's backpack was already half filled with phones. Almost all the pickpockets in the entire station had been visited by him. But Eamon didn't underestimate these pickpockets because of this. After he felt it was enough, he immediately boarded a short-distance bus with an hour's journey. For no other reason than simply not wanting to encounter trouble when those clumsy thieves discovered their things were missing. 2 hours later, Eamon had 4,000 or 5,000 yuan more in both his phone and his pocket. Based on his expenses for the past few days, he felt this was enough. After once again getting a fence boss into trouble, Eamon strolled around the small town oblivious, putting some small items he couldn't conveniently buy before into his bag. Of course, some things he still couldn't conveniently buy right now. However, when he encountered those items, Eamon would choose to steal them directly and then leave enough money. Upon noticing these changes in Eamon, the police on the other end of the surveillance showed slight smiles. Although he was still stealing, the current Eamon was considerably different from the previous Eamon. Eamon didn't know about the gradual change in the police's perception of him. He simply didn't want to cause trouble. Every step leaves a trace. This was something that Show-Off Rosal had copied from somewhere, but Eamon understood that this saying held much truth. Since he was determined to completely shake off the police, shake off the past, and shake off that annoying old man, Eamon didn't want to leave any clues that could lead them to him. But ultimately, Eamon was just a 7-year-old child. His size dictated that the things he could steal were very limited. So, 2 days later, when he was finally ready to set off again, Amon's luggage only contained a few changes of clothes, 2 magnesium rods for starting fires, waterproof matches, a windproof lighter, a screwdriver, nail clippers, an outdoor knife, and some miscellaneous small items. As for the tent he really wanted, he had no chance to acquire it. After all, a 7-year-old buying a tent would be too strange. This kid seems to be planning for a long-term struggle. After the initial few days of tension, the Serious Crimes Unit had relaxed a lot. Although someone was still monitoring the surveillance 24 hours a day, the earlier state of alarm was gone. After all, the police force's resources are limited, and a task clearly set to drag on for the long term couldn't continuously occupy so many resources. As Eamon ran further and further, they could only, under the leadership of the military representative, continuously cooperate with nearby brother units. And with more people joining, the work each person needed to monitor naturally decreased. However, even so, many relevant police officers would still come over to watch the surveillance in their spare time. For them, Amon's outdoor survival live stream was much more interesting than those outdoor content creators. Well, the fun seeker attribute indeed seems to be contagious. Chief of the Serious Crimes Unit, the news is back. Eamon bought a ticket to Dali this time. Dali. This kid isn't planning to go to Myanmar, is he? The police officer who had once been an anti-drug officer immediately tensed up, and the others, hearing this, also frowned. If he stayed within the country, everything would be fine, but if it really involved foreign forces, then it would be troublesome. The military does not operate domestically, and the police do not operate internationally. This is a rule and a law. Moreover, it's much more chaotic outside than at home. Don't look at how unbridled that child is in the country. If he went abroad, no matter how capable he was, it's not guaranteed he would return in one piece. The conference room fell silent for a moment. The chief of the Serious Crimes Unit sighed slightly, looking at Lianbong, who had a conflicted expression but stubbornly refused to speak. However, he didn't make a decision immediately but said, "Notify relevant personnel. We're holding a meeting." Eamon didn't know that a fierce discussion had already begun over whether to hand him over to the military or intercept him within the national border. At this moment, he was sitting on a long-distance bus heading to Dali, scrolling through short videos. As he got further and further from the city where Lianbong was, Amon's mood became increasingly relaxed. He even started buying some interesting handicrafts or climbed over walls into amusement parks to enjoy some childish entertainment. He even wanted to experience working life, if not for his young age. Of course, strictly speaking, he actually had some experience. For example, outside a certain university, he once helped a young lady hand out flyers, though he felt the way that young lady looked at him was a bit strange. Soon I'll be able to leave this country. Eamon closed the short video app and glanced at the world map on his screensaver. For some reason, his heart felt a bit complex. It had been 2 months since he escaped from Lianbong's side. If he hadn't run away, school should be starting soon, right? However, almost the instant the thought arose, he kicked that superfluous emotion out of his mind. After all, he was Eamon. Chapter 43, Not All Illusions Are Useful. Amon's Great Adventure 28. Bo po mo fo, detain Ayla. Bo po mo fo, detain Ayla. In the spacious and bright classroom, childish voices merged into one, echoing back and forth above the classroom. Eamon sat dejectedly in the second-to-last row by the window, following his classmates in reading the so-called childish pinyin. For a moment, he felt nothing but immense regret. How did he get caught in the first place? In reality, Eamon was caught by the border guard army before he even saw the boundary marker. However, due to his young age, there was no suspicion. Then, Lianbong, who had rushed over after hearing the news, brought him back to this city and confiscated all the little gadgets he had created. After that, he became an elementary school student. Until this moment, Eamon still didn't know that his escape journey had been under surveillance the entire time. He still believed that his capture was purely because he had chosen the wrong route. That's right, he thought he had chosen the wrong path. Although the country that path led to was indeed chaotic, it was precisely because of this that the army on the border was always on high alert. If he had another chance, Eamon felt he should choose a relatively peaceful small country as a stepping stone, making it less likely to be caught by the army. No, I can't be hasty. I've just been brought back, and there must be many people watching me now. While these little brats probably aren't involved, that fake smiling homeroom teacher, along with these other teachers, the security guard at the door, and that old man sweeping the floor, they could all be police. Eamon looked through the window at the old man sweeping downstairs, feeling like everyone looked like a police officer. How does that saying go? You see others as what you yourself are. Eamon is a mythical creature who likes to implement saturated surveillance to the extreme. If he wants to monitor someone and torment their spirit, he will turn all replaceable objects around them into avatars. With this habit, he naturally assumed the police would do the same, especially after he heard those fool thieves talk about plainclothes police, which deepened this perception. Eamon, here. Eamon suddenly jolted, realizing he had been lost in thought and forgotten to read pinyin with his classmates. At the same time, he once again resented this weak body, which couldn't even manage multi-threaded thinking. Ha 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 ha. Many children in the class laughed when they saw someone in trouble, while the middle-aged woman on the podium pushed up her glasses and frowned. Eamon, it's very bad to zone out during class. As punishment, you must copy the consonant chart 10 times when you go home and hand it to me tomorrow morning. The Chinese teacher assigned the punishment almost without hesitation, but Eamon was more concerned with the detail of her pushing her glasses. In that instant, he even instinctively wanted to look around for anyone wearing similar glasses. The fool. It shouldn't be. Eamon frowned, obediently admitting his error, but his vigilance had once again increased by a few points. Elementary school lessons are very relaxed, especially at the beginning of the semester, where they only learn a few simple Chinese characters and pinyin. For Eamon, these were things he had already mastered at the orphanage. After class, the elementary students quickly clustered together, with various noises incessant. A few little girls discussed which characters were the best match in last night's TV drama and who was a little bitch, while a few boys, who probably hadn't even remembered each other's names, ran wildly around the tables, occasionally letting out 2 screams. Eamon, completely unable to understand these human cubs, frowned. Because phones were not allowed at school, he could only hold a notebook, drawing and planning his next prison break. You're an idiot. No, you're an idiot. Suddenly, 2 boys, spouting vulgarities they probably didn't even understand, approached Eamon. Eamon frowned at this, lowering his head, not wanting to deal with them. Unexpectedly, one of them directly came closer and loudly said, "Hey, you, Eamon, right. Which Ultraman do you think is the strongest?" "It's definitely Tiga." "How strong is Tiga?" "The first light in the world." "What do you know?" Gaia is the strongest. Gaia means Earth, you know. You don't know. You don't know. You're an idiot. No, you're an idiot. Seeing the two kids start to bicker again, Eamon felt a headache coming on. But he couldn't just slap these human cubs to death, not because he couldn't do it, nor because he lacked the heart, but because doing so would cause him trouble. That's it. Eamon habitually gave an explanation for his behavior, then sighed slightly in his heart, turned his head, and said, "What is Ultraman? You don't know Ultraman. Are you an alien from somewhere?" Eamon was startled by this question and couldn't help but feel a little guilty. In a sense, he was indeed an alien. However, this kind of thing must never be exposed. After all, he had researched the treatment of aliens on Earth and had seen nothing but chilling phrases like slicing, imprisonment, and breeding research. So, he suppressed his guilt, intending to humbly ask for information. But then the two kids, who had been arguing fiercely just a moment ago, suddenly seemed to reconcile, and simultaneously pulled out a small stack of circular cards from their pockets. "This is Ultraman, this is Tiga. Super powerful. Don't listen to him, Gaia is the strongest. Look, this is Gaia. Is there any difference between the two?" Eamon looked at the two round-eyed figures on the cards, who certainly didn't look human, but he wasn't surprised. After all, he had seen things that looked even stranger than that. "Of course there's a difference," the two children said in unison, and then their words became noisy. "What about the shape of the timer? What about the basic color scheme? What about the switching of different forms? What about the differences in abilities and human hosts?" For a moment, Eamon even wondered if these were really settings that children who couldn't even remember pinyin could articulate. Could it be that this Ultraman is really common knowledge for humans in this world? Quote, "Old Lee, how's your kid's school life?" In the police station office, the conference room, which had become a gathering place for officers during breaks, played Amon's school life on the monitor. Although it was a bit boring compared to Amon's escape, the daily routine of an elementary student was actually quite therapeutic for the police. It looks pretty good, at least he's not aggressive. Leon Bong looked at Eamon in the picture, nodding and listening to the two kids talk about Ultraman, and said with a smile, "I'll buy him a set of Ultraman DVDs after work. Maybe I'll rent them first. That kid is quite mature, it would be a waste if he didn't like them. By the way, Xiao Lu, which Ultraman has a better storyline?" I heard these tokusatsu shows actually have a lot of depth now." Hearing Captain Leon Bong's question, Xiao Lu immediately stood up, saluted, and then said in a very solemn tone, "Captain, first, I must correct you, Ultraman is not only liked by immature people." In the spacious and bright bedroom, various Ultraman posters adorned the walls, and the desk was covered with all sorts of Ultraman-themed merchandise and toys. A teenager with a black eye sat at the desk, placing the last of his homework into his backpack. He then stood up, looking at the wall clock with a sigh. "How many times is this? 6 or 7? Amon's lips curved slightly. It had been 7 years since he arrived in this world, and he had already escaped 6 times. Although each time he was caught before leaving the country, he had never given up the idea of escaping. It wasn't that his current life was so unbearable, it was purely an act of defiance. It was probably the feeling of, the more you want me to live this way, the less I will fulfill your wishes. Though a bit childish, Eamon had come to terms with it. Wasn't he just a child now? Those despicable adults actually tampered with my phone. If I hadn't seen the girl in front of me browsing Weibo, I wouldn't have even noticed. Thinking of this, Eamon gritted his teeth in anger. Now he understood why he had been caught so coincidentally at the border those previous times. So he had been under their surveillance all along. But this time will be different. I've seen through your tricks. These childish games are nothing once they're exposed. Eamon secretly cheered himself on, mentally replanning his entire escape route. Previous escapes had always been around summer vacation, which had left a stereotypical impression on the police. This time, if he left a bit earlier, they should be caught off guard. Eamon opened his phone and checked his messages, an unsettling smile appearing on his face, which was turned away from the window. The old man has to work overtime these days. The police station must be busy with an important case. During this time, they probably won't be able to pay attention to me. Now 12 or 13 years old, Eamon was no longer as helpless as he once was. Though he still looked a bit young, his height of 1.6 meters was no longer short. After realizing that his phone and computer might have been tampered with, he had been studying computer and mobile phone knowledge. With his excellent mind, he had already mastered how to crack a smartphone. Having finally made up his mind, Eamon went to the small restaurant downstairs, pretending that his dad was working overtime and he had to get his own meal. After a simple meal, he thought for a moment and then walked towards the internet cafe his classmate had told him about. Although, theoretically, internet cafes required ID cards, many internet cafes, in order to make money, would turn a blind eye to middle school students like him. So Eamon easily obtained a computer he could use freely, connected a data cable, and began to crack the phone he had casually picked up on the way. Throughout the process, his own phone's camera remained pressed against the desk. Only after the stolen phone's fingerprint lock and password were reset did Eamon pick up the phone, satisfied, and leave the internet cafe as quietly as possible, leaving the phone with surveillance and information interference in the internet cafe. They saw me enter the internet cafe, so they shouldn't notice my escape for a while. But I can't be careless about this. First, I'll find a shop to change clothes. My shoes need to be changed too, there might be listening devices or trackers inside them. Eamon logged into his Alipay on his phone, ducked into a clothing store, and started shopping. He bought the new clothes and put them on immediately, then casually tossed the paper bag containing his old clothes into a trash can after leaving the store. After replacing all items that came from Lianbong, Eamon finally felt a sense of relief, a lightness in his body. However, this lightness was accompanied by a somewhat uncomfortable feeling. Why do I suddenly have a bad premonition? Is there some detail I haven't handled properly? Eamon frowned, making his way to the high-speed rail station as planned, while mentally reviewing his plan to ensure there were no omissions. But he didn't dare ignore his intuition. After all, this was the only ability he had left that could be called extraordinary since he became a child. Maybe the police have already discovered my escape. The high-speed rail might be a bit risky. I'll take a taxi instead. Eamon pondered for a moment and decided on a more cautious strategy. He called a ride-hailing car through Didi and headed towards the suburbs. However, this time, he retraced the route of his first escape. Generally, ordinary people wouldn't choose the same route after failing once, but Eamon intended to exploit this psychological aspect this time. After all, the police station's manpower was limited. Even if someone was truly keeping an eye on him and would stake out his potential escape routes, the probability of them staking out a route that had already been used was not high. With this thought, Eamon arrived at the suburbs of that year. However, the piano school there had already closed down, and only the storefront downstairs had become a mediocre, fly-ridden restaurant. Compared to that year, his journey this time was significantly faster. However, just as dusk was falling and he was still a few kilometers from his destination, a police car blocked his path. Tisk. Amon's face immediately turned ashen. He thought, this time they're not even waiting for me to reach the border, are they? He was thinking, was this situation because he had left his phone behind, so they couldn't track him, or for some other reason? Only one car had come this time. Did he have a chance to steal the car and escape? Eamon, Captain Lee is in trouble. Quote! The string of plans in his mind shattered into pieces after a single sentence from the police officer who got out of the car. He almost didn't think before asking. What happened? Injured on duty, currently in the hospital for emergency treatment. The officer didn't waste words, just quietly looked at this kid who caused such a commotion every year. Eamon looked into the other's eyes, confirmed that the other person wasn't joking, then pulled out the stolen phone, shoved it into the officer's hand, and then got into the back seat of the police car. 20 minutes later, Eamon appeared in a hospital room. Lianbong was lying on the bed, his face terrifyingly pale. Seeing Eamon appear, Lianbong forced a smile and said, "Sorry, it looks like I won't be able to play cops and robbers with you this time." What happened? Eamon looked at Lianbong's face. Using the doctor's knowledge he had once stolen, he could tell that this man did not have long to live. Nothing, just an accident. Lianbong didn't seem to want to tell Eamon the details of his injury. He just sighed and said in a tone of giving final instructions. "I don't know why you always want to escape, but I hope you can trust us. If you have any unavoidable difficulties, I hope you can." Lianbong ultimately didn't finish his sentence before being surrounded by medical staff again. Eamon looked at the busy doctors and nurses with a somewhat bewildered expression, then silently walked out of the ward. As if having made some kind of decision, he silently chanted in the supernatural language he hadn't used for several years. "The fool that doesn't belong to this era, the mysterious ruler above the gray fog, the king of yellow and black who wields good fortune." After the honorific was recited, nothing happened. Eamon stood in the open space in front of the hospital, looking up at the sky. After a long silence, he spoke. "You win." For more thrilling fanfiction stories like this, check out my channel Fanfic Audiobook. Dive into epic adventures, mysterious realms, and legendary journeys brought to life through immersive storytelling. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more amazing audiobooks.